After spending 16 hours in the hospital watching my patient of 8 years take her final breaths, I collapsed in an adjacent waiting room only to hear my husband whisper, "Once Heidi's little nursing career fails, I'll file for divorce and take half the house." His lawyer replied, "Just wait until her grief passes. Courts hate when you leave during hardship." I silently walked away. By morning, I was in Mrs. Lillian's lawyer's office, discovering I'd inherited her entire fortune of $4 million. The manila envelope felt heavy in my hands as I stood in the sterile hospital hallway. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Inside was Mrs. Lillian Montgomery's final gift to me. Her last letter, handwritten despite her trembling hands. After 8 years as her caregiver, watching her decline had broken something inside me. The doctors had said it would be any day now, and I'd barely left her side for the past 72 hours. I tucked the envelope into my bag, too emotionally, exhausted to read it now. I needed a moment alone, away from the beeping machines and sympathetic glances from the hospital staff who knew how close Mrs. Lillian and I had become. More than a patient, she'd become the grandmother I never had, filling my life with stories of her adventures as one of the first female photojournalists in the 1960s. The waiting room 2 doors down was empty, a small mercy in the otherwise crowded hospital. I sank into the vinyl chair, my body finally acknowledging the exhaustion of the marathon vigil. I hadn't called Dylan yet. My husband would be worried, or at least he should be. Our marriage had grown increasingly distant over the past year, as he focused on his struggling architectural firm, and I devoted more time to Mrs. Lillian's care. I closed my eyes, just for a moment. The sound of hushed voices from the hallway barely registered until I heard my name. Heidi's been at the hospital for days now. It's the perfect timing, actually. My husband's voice. My eyes snapped open, but I remained perfectly still, hidden by the high-backed chair facing away from the door. "You sure about the timing, Dylan? Courts don't look kindly on divorcing when a spouse is going through something difficult." An unfamiliar voice, professional, measured. "Look, Kurt, I've been planning this for months. That old lady she's been taking care of is finally dying. Once that happens, Heidi's little nursing career is going to fall apart. She's put everything into caring for this one patient, neglected building a real client base. She'll be emotionally wrecked and financially vulnerable." My breath caught in my throat. The room seemed to tilt as Dylan continued, his words precise, calculated. "I've documented everything. How her focus on this one patient has affected our marriage, how she's been unavailable, emotionally and physically. I've built a case that shows she abandoned the marriage first." "And the house?" the other man, Kurt, asked. "We bought it together, but I've made most of the payments this past year while she reduced her hours to care for the old lady. I can claim I've contributed significantly more. With the market values now, my half would be enough to clear my business debts and give me a fresh start." Business debts? Dylan had told me his firm was just going through a slow period. Another lie. In what was apparently a carefully constructed web of deception. "Just wait until after the funeral," Kurt advised. "Let her process her grief a bit, then we'll file. You don't want to look heartless. Judges are still human." Dylan laughed softly, a sound I once found warm but now sent ice through my veins. "Don't worry, I can play the supportive husband for a few more weeks. I've gotten pretty good at it. Besides, it's not like Heidi has anything else. No family to speak of, few close friends since she's spent all her time with her patients. That house is all she has, and I'll be taking half of it." "And you're sure there's nothing else? No surprises?" Kurt asked. "What could there be? She's a home health aide who spends her life caring for dying people. She makes barely enough to cover her own expenses. There's nothing else to consider." The 2 men moved further down the hall, their voices fading into the ambient hospital noise. I sat frozen, my fingers clutching the armrest so tightly my knuckles had turned white. The husband I had loved and supported for 6 years had just revealed himself to be a stranger, calculating, cold, waiting like a vulture for the perfect moment to strike. Mrs. Lillian had warned me once, in her gentle way. "Heidi, dear, does he value what you do? Really value it? Because a man who doesn't understand caring for others will never truly understand you." I had dismissed her concerns as the protective instinct of someone who had come to see me as family. Family. The word echoed in my mind as I thought about Mrs. Lillian lying 2 floors above, her life slipping away while my life as I knew it was simultaneously unraveling. She had no biological family left, no children, no siblings, no distant cousins to gather around her bed. Just me, the caregiver who had read to her daily, who had learned to cook her favorite Southern dishes, who had listened to every story about her remarkable life with genuine interest. I felt something crumple in my hand and looked down to see Mrs. Lillian's envelope, now slightly crushed from my grip. In my shock, I had pulled it from my bag without realizing. With trembling fingers, I opened it, needing some connection to the woman who had shown me more genuine love than my own husband apparently ever had. The letter inside was written in her delicate, slanting script, the letters wobbling with the effort it must have taken in her weakened state. I began to read, tears blurring the words. "My dearest Heidi, by the time you read this, I will have left this world for whatever adventure comes next. Please don't grieve too deeply. At 91, I've had more than my fair share of time, and you made my final years rich with dignity and friendship. You came into my life when I was ready to give up, a widow with no children, no family to speak of, and a body that was beginning to betray me. You were meant to be temporary, just another caregiver in a long line of them. But from the first day, when you noticed the photographs on my wall and asked genuine questions about my time in Vietnam, rather than empty pleasantries, I knew you were different. For 8 years you have been my companion, my confidant, and yes, the daughter I never had. You've sacrificed so much to care for me, time, energy, opportunities, and I suspect, perhaps even parts of your marriage. I've watched you place the needs of others before your own, time and again, without complaint or expectation of reward. It is for this reason that I have made arrangements with my attorney, Mr. Jackson Pierce. You will find his contact information enclosed. I know you never asked for anything, never expected anything, which makes you the perfect person to entrust with everything I leave behind. My home, my investments, my photography collection. All of it now belongs to you. The value is considerable, approximately $4 million, the result of smart investments and a rather substantial settlement from my late husband's family business. Use it to build the life you deserve, Heidi. A life where your generous heart is protected, where your gifts are valued, where you can continue to care for others but from a position of strength, not sacrifice. Remember what I told you about my photographs. Sometimes you must step back to see the whole picture. I fear there are aspects of your life that, like a photograph too closely examined, have lost their true meaning and context. Step back, my dear. See clearly. With eternal gratitude and love, Lillian Montgomery. The letter fell to my lap as the full weight of both revelations crashed into me at once. The husband I trusted was calculating the most advantageous time to abandon me, while the patient I had cared for had silently been planning to give me a future I never could have imagined. Stood up, tucking the letter carefully back into the envelope. A strange calm had replaced the initial shock. I knew exactly what I needed to do. In the hallway, there was no sign of Dylan or his lawyer. I took the elevator to the ground floor, walked to my car, and drove home in the pre-dawn darkness. Our house, the one Dylan was so eager to claim half of, looked different somehow, smaller and less significant now that I saw it through new eyes. I packed a small bag with essentials, found my passport, and left a single note on the kitchen counter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Taking some time to grieve. Don't call. Nothing more. Nothing that would reveal what I had overheard or what I had learned. As the sun began to rise, I was already on the highway, Mrs. Lillian's letter safely tucked against my heart, heading toward the address of Mr. Jackson Pierce, attorney at law. It was time, as Mrs. Lillian had suggested, to step back and see the whole picture. And then, to reframe it entirely. My life before that fateful night in the hospital waiting room had a comfortable predictability to it. I'd wake each morning at 5:30, careful not to disturb Dylan as he slept. He'd always claimed to be a light sleeper, though the truth was he rarely stirred when I left our bed. 6 years of marriage had established our rhythms, separate but harmonious, or so I'd believed. Our modest 2-story home in Oak Ridge Heights was exactly what we'd dreamed of when we married. The neighborhood sat on the edge of the city, close enough for Dylan's commute to his architectural firm downtown, but far enough out that we could afford more space. We'd stretched ourselves financially to buy it, both of us believing it represented our future together. I'd painted every room myself, planted perennials along the walkway, and created a small herb garden off the kitchen that supplied fresh rosemary and basil for our meals. "You've made it a home, Heidi," Dylan would say, especially when we entertained his colleagues. He'd place his arm around my waist, pull me close, and I'd feel that familiar pride, that despite my modest career, I'd created something beautiful. For us. Now I wonder if those moments were merely performances for his professional network, part of the carefully crafted image he presented to the world. My mornings followed the same pattern for years. Coffee in my favorite blue ceramic mug, a wedding gift from Dylan's mother, a quick breakfast, then checking my phone for any updates from my patients' families. As a certified home health aide specializing in end-of-life care, my schedule varied with my patients' needs, but I tried to maintain some consistency. For the past 8 years, Mrs. Lillian Montgomery had been my constant. I'd taken her on as a patient when I was fresh from certification, intimidated by her grand Victorian home, filled with artifacts from her travels as a photojournalist. She'd covered everything from the civil rights movement to Vietnam, her black and white photographs telling stories that words couldn't capture. "You have kind eyes," she'd told me during our first meeting. "Too many people look at the old as if we're already ghosts. You still see the person." What had begun as a 3-day-a-week assignment became 5 days, then expanded to include evening check-ins and weekend visits as her health declined. The agency I worked for had other clients for me, of course, but Mrs. Lillian always took precedence. I'd rearranged my entire professional life around her care. Dylan had supported my dedication at first. "It's what makes you special," he'd say. "Not everyone could do what you do." But as the years passed and his architectural firm struggled to establish itself, his perspective shifted. The late-night calls from Mrs. Lillian were met with sighs and eye rolls. My reduced income as I devoted more time to her became a point of tension during our monthly budget discussions. "It's not sustainable," he'd argued 6 months ago, his voice tight with frustration. "We're barely keeping up with the mortgage, and you're essentially volunteering at this point." He wasn't entirely wrong. The agency only paid for scheduled hours, not the extras I provided, picking up groceries, organizing her medications, staying late to read to her when she couldn't sleep. Mrs. Lillian lived on a fixed income, and while her home was valuable, her liquid assets were modest. I couldn't bring myself to charge her more. "Some things are more important than money," I'd told Dylan. "She has no one else." "And what about us?" he'd asked. "What about our future?" That conversation ended like most of our disagreements lately, unresolved, with both of us retreating to separate corners of our lives. Dylan buried himself in his work, taking on small residential projects that barely covered his office overhead. I focused on Mrs. Lillian's increasingly complex care needs, My days with Mrs. Lillian were filled with small rituals that gave her comfort. Earl Grey, tea with a splash of milk in the morning, reading the newspaper aloud, though we always skipped. The obituaries, "I'll be in there soon enough," she'd joke. On good days, I'd help her sort through her vast collection of photographs, each one accompanied by a story of the people and places she'd encountered. "That's my life's work right there," she once told me, gesturing to the carefully preserved albums. Not just taking pictures, but really seeing people, understanding their struggles, their joys, capturing something true about them. Her walls were covered with her most famous works: Martin Luther King Jr. addressing a crowd, his expression both determined and serene. A Vietnamese child running from conflict, terror, and resilience etched in equal measure on her face. Gloria Steinem speaking at a women's rally, passion radiating from her stance. Mrs. Lillian had witnessed history and preserved it through her unique lens. Meanwhile, my marriage had begun to fade like an old photograph, the colors washing out so gradually I barely noticed. Dylan and I still shared meals occasionally, still slept in the same bed, still said, "I love you," before hanging up the phone. But the words had become habitual rather than heartfelt, at least on his part. I'd attributed the distance to stress, to his struggling business, to my demanding schedule with Mrs. Lillian. I'd believed we just needed to weather this temporary storm. My closest friend, Elizabeth, had tried to warn me. During our monthly coffee dates, the one social commitment I refused to cancel despite my hectic schedule, she'd gently probed. "When was the last time you and Dylan went out together? Just the two of you?" I couldn't remember. "Has he come with you to visit Mrs. Lillian lately?" I thought they got along well. They had, in the beginning. Dylan had been charmed by Mrs. Lillian's sharp wit and fascinating stories, but he hadn't visited in over a year. "Heidi, I'm asking because I care. You're pouring everything into others. Your patience, especially Mrs. Lillian, even Dylan's needs. But who's looking out for you?" I'd dismissed her concerns with practiced ease. "That's just this season of life. Dylan's business will stabilize, Mrs. Lillian." I couldn't finish that sentence. We both knew Mrs. Lillian's condition was terminal. Things will settle down. Eventually. Elizabeth hadn't pushed, but her worried expression said enough. She saw what I couldn't, or wouldn't, see. The week before everything changed, there had been a moment, a small tear in the fabric of my carefully constructed reality. I'd come home late from Mrs. Lillian's after she'd experienced a frightening episode of breathlessness. The house was dark except for the blue light of Dylan's laptop illuminating his face in his home office. He was hunched over his keyboard, so engrossed he didn't hear me enter. I'd moved to kiss his cheek, a habitual gesture of connection, when I glimpsed his screen. He was looking at apartments, one-bedroom units in the trendy downtown district, near his office. He'd closed the browser quickly, too quickly, murmuring something about a client's request for urban living options. I'd accepted the explanation because the alternative was too painful to consider. That night, lying beside him in the darkness, I'd stared at the ceiling and wondered if the distance between us was still bridgeable, or if we'd already drifted too far apart. Looking back, I see now that I was standing in the shallows of a truth I wasn't ready to wade into. My world, my marriage, my sense of purpose through my work, my understanding of my place in the lives of others, was balanced on assumptions that were about to be washed away in a single night, leaving me either to drown or to learn to swim in much deeper waters. The call came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. I'd been sleeping lightly, as I had for months, one ear always alert for my phone. Mary, the night nurse who checked on Mrs. Lillian when I couldn't be there, spoke in the measured tones of someone delivering difficult but expected news. "Her vitals are declining, Heidi. The hospice doctor says it could be hours or days, but I think you should come now." I was already pulling on clothes before we disconnected, moving with the quiet efficiency that comes from years of middle-of-the-night emergencies. In the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and caught my reflection in the mirror. Eyes shadowed from months of interrupted sleep, hair hastily pulled back, the faint lines around my mouth deeper than they'd been a year ago. Dylan stirred as I gathered my things, propping himself up on one elbow. "Mrs. Montgomery?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "Yes. Mary thinks it's time." I zipped my bag, already mentally preparing for what lay ahead. "I don't know when I'll be back." He nodded, reaching for his phone to check the time. "Do you want me to come?" I could rearrange some meetings. For a moment, I was touched by the offer. It had been so long since Dylan had shown interest in this part of my life. "No, that's okay. You have that presentation for the Westbrook project today, right? I'll call when I need you." He settled back against the pillows, relief flickering across his face so quickly I almost missed it. "Call me with updates. And Heidi? Take care of yourself too, okay?" I leaned down to kiss him goodbye, a gesture that once felt natural but now seemed performed, like actors going through familiar motions. As I pulled away, Dylan caught my wrist, his fingers warm against my pulse. "Remember what we talked about. After Mrs. Montgomery, you might consider taking a break. Maybe look into other career options." The suggestion wasn't new. Dylan had been increasingly vocal about his belief that my work was too emotionally draining, too poorly compensated, too consuming. Part of me wondered if he was right, if watching people navigate their final journey was slowly eroding something essential in me. "Let's talk about it later," I said, gently pulling my wrist free. "I need to go." The drive to Mrs. Lillian's Victorian home took 20 minutes in the pre-dawn emptiness of the streets. She had refused hospitalization until the very end, insisting that she wanted to die where I've lived, surrounded by my photographs and memories, not beeping machines. We'd honored her wishes, converting her sunroom into a hospice space with a hospital bed positioned to give her a view of the garden she could no longer tend. When I arrived, Mary met me at the door, her face grave. "She's been asking for you." Became quite agitated until I said you were on your way. In the sunroom, Mrs. Lillian lay small and fragile beneath the quilt her mother had made decades ago. The oxygen concentrator hummed softly, and the medication pump administered carefully measured doses of morphine to keep her comfortable. Her eyes were closed, the skin of her face paper-thin and mapped with delicate blue veins. I set my bag down and took her hand in mine. Her eyes fluttered open, cloudy with medication but still alert enough to recognize me. "Heidi," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You came." "Of course I came," I said, smoothing her silver hair back from her forehead. "I promised I'd be here, didn't I?" The ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Good girl. Always keeping promises." Over the next hours, Mrs. Lillian drifted in and out of consciousness. When she was awake, I gave her small sips of water, moistened her lips with glycerin swabs, and listened as she moved between the present and fragments of her past. She spoke of her late husband, Emmett, of assignments in war zones, of regrets and triumphs. Sometimes she mistook me for people from her past, her editor, her mother, a subject from a photograph taken half a century ago. I called Dylan around noon to update him. The call went to voicemail, which wasn't unusual when he was in meetings. I left a brief message, more out of habit than expectation of response. Mrs. Lillian's doctor visited mid-afternoon, confirming what we already knew. Her organs were shutting down, her body preparing for its final journey. "Hours," he murmured to me in the hallway. "Maybe until morning. She's holding on for something." As evening approached, Mrs. Lillian became unexpectedly lucid. Her eyes, suddenly clear and focused, found mine as I adjusted her pillows. "In my desk," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "Top drawer. There's an envelope for you." I knew the desk she meant. An antique roll top in her study, where she had organized her photographs and written her memoirs in recent years. "I'll get it later, Mrs. Lillian. Right now, let me—" "Now," she insisted. "Please." Something in her tone brooked no argument. I squeezed her hand. "I'll be right back." The study was exactly as she'd left it months ago, when getting out of bed became too difficult. Books on photography and journalism filled the shelves, alongside framed awards and more personal mementos. The desk was meticulously organized, each drawer containing neatly labeled folders. In the top drawer, as promised, sat a cream-colored envelope with my name written in Mrs. Lillian's elegant script. I started to open it, but Mrs. Lillian's voice called weakly from the sunroom. "Heidi?" I tucked the envelope into my pocket and returned to her bedside. "I found it. I'll read it later." She shook her head slightly. "No secrets between us. Read it now." With reluctant fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter on heavy stationery and a business card for Jackson Pierce, attorney at law. I skimmed the first lines of the letter. "My dearest Heidi, when you read this, I will have completed my journey. There are matters we need to discuss regarding your future." My eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. Lillian, you don't need to—" "I've watched you," she interrupted, each word measured, preserved, as if she'd been saving her strength for this moment. 8 years, giving everything, taking little. I tried to protest, but she continued. "Your husband doesn't see your worth. I've seen the way he looks at you now, different than before." A chill ran through me. I'd never discussed my marriage troubles with Mrs. Lillian, had never wanted to burden her with my personal concerns, yet somehow her photographer's eye had captured what I had tried to hide. "The envelope," she said. "Promise me. You'll go to Jackson. After." "I promise," I whispered, though I had no idea what awaited me in that meeting. She seemed satisfied, her body relaxing slightly against the pillows. "My photographs, on the walls. Which is your favorite?" It was an unexpected question, but I answered without hesitation. "The woman in Paris standing on the bridge. She looks like she's deciding whether to go forward or turn back." Mrs. Lillian smiled. "Decision point. Every life has them." Her breathing grew more labored as night fell. I called Dylan again, leaving another message to let him know I wouldn't be home. The night nurse offered to take over, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Something told me these were our final hours together, and I wouldn't squander them. In the small hours of the morning, Mrs. Lillian opened her eyes one last time. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me." I held her hand as her breathing slowed, then finally stopped altogether. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, counting out seconds in a world that now contained one less remarkable soul. After the hospice nurse confirmed her passing and made the necessary calls, the funeral home staff arrived with gentle efficiency to take her body. I found myself alone in the grand old house, filled with the evidence of an extraordinary life. Exhaustion crashed over me in waves. I needed to call Dylan to let him know, but my body demanded rest first. I made my way to the small guest room I'd occasionally use during Mrs. Lillian's final months, intending to lie down for just a moment. The envelope with Mr. Pierce's card, pressed against my hip as I lay down, a physical reminder of a promise made to a woman who had trusted me with her care, and perhaps with something more. My last thought before sleep claimed me was of Mrs. Lillian's favorite saying, one she'd repeated throughout her illness. "The most important photograph is never the one you plan to take, but the one that finds you when you least expect it." Little did I know how prophetic those words would prove to be. I woke disoriented, the unfamiliar ceiling of Mrs. Lillian's guest room momentarily confusing me. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the antique quilt. For one blessed moment, I existed in the liminal space between sleep and full consciousness, Before memory crashed back, Mrs. Lillian was gone. My watch showed 10:38 a.m. I'd slept for nearly 5 hours, my body surrendering to exhaustion. After the long vigil, I reached for my phone, finding 3 missed calls from the hospice service and 1 from Elizabeth, but nothing from Dylan. I sent him a brief text. She passed peacefully around 4 a.m. We'll call later. After washing my face and borrowing a clean blouse from the closet, Mrs. Lillian had insisted I keep a few changes of clothes at her house. I made my way downstairs. The house felt different, emptier somehow, as if the building itself recognized the absence of its longtime occupant. I made coffee in the kitchen where I'd prepared countless meals for Mrs. Lillian, the familiar routine providing small comfort. The hospice coordinator arrived at noon to help me navigate the immediate aftermath, confirming funeral arrangements. Mrs. Lillian had pre-planned, collecting medical equipment for return, providing grief resources. I functioned on autopilot, signing forms and answering questions with mechanical efficiency. When she left, the silence felt oppressive. I needed to go home, to shower properly, to reconnect with Dylan. The envelope from Mrs. Lillian sat on the kitchen counter where I'd placed it. Mr. Pierce's business card beside it. I'd call him tomorrow, I decided. Today was for processing, for beginning the grief that would likely come in waves for months. The drive home felt surreal. The world continued as normal. People walking dogs, picking up children from school, going about their Wednesday routines, while I moved through it in a bubble of loss. I kept expecting my phone to ring with Mrs. Lillian's ringtone, a habit so ingrained I'd probably jump at that sound for months to come. Our house was empty when I arrived, Dylan's car absent from the driveway. I checked my phone again. Still no response to my text. That wasn't entirely unusual. He often got absorbed in work and lost track of time. Still, a flicker of hurt passed through me. My patient of 8 years had died, and my husband couldn't manage a simple, "I'm sorry," or "How are you?" I showered, letting hot water wash away the physical remnants of the long night. Afterward, wrapped in my robe, I called Elizabeth. "Oh, Heidi," she said when I told her about Mrs. Lillian. "I'm so sorry. Do you want me to come over?" "No, but thank you. I'm just processing, I guess. Dylan should be home soon." Even as I said it, I wondered if that was true. "How are you really doing?" Elizabeth pressed. "It's a big loss. She was more than just a patient to you." Tears I'd been holding back finally spilled over. "She saw me, Elizabeth. Really saw me. Sometimes I think she's the only one who did." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. "That's a profound thing to say about someone who wasn't your husband." Her gentle observation landed like a stone in still water, ripples of truth expanding outward. Before I could respond, I heard the garage door opening. "Dylan's home. I should go." "Call me any time, day or night," Elizabeth said. "I mean it." I hung up and quickly dried my tears, not wanting Dylan to see me cry. It had been months since I'd been vulnerable with him, a unconscious self-protection I hadn't fully acknowledged until now. But it wasn't Dylan who entered the kitchen. It was a delivery person with a package requiring signature. By the time I'd dealt with it, my phone was ringing. The hospital. "Mrs. Reynolds? This is Andrea from Springfield Memorial. There's some paperwork regarding Mrs. Montgomery that requires your signature as her healthcare proxy. Would you be able to come in today?" I glanced at the clock. Nearly 4 p.m. "Yes, I can be there in about an hour." After leaving a note for Dylan explaining where I'd gone, I drove to the hospital. The administrative process took longer than expected. Forms confirming medical decisions made during Mrs. Lillian's previous hospitalizations, release of personal effects, donation of usable medical supplies to the hospital's community program. By the time I finished, it was after 7 p.m. and exhaustion was setting in again. I texted Dylan. "Still at hospital. Paperwork for Mrs. L. Need anything from store on way home?" No response came as I walked through the stark hospital corridors, fluorescent lights humming overhead. My body ached from tension and lack of proper rest, my emotions raw and too close to the surface. I needed to get home, to crawl into bed, possibly to finally cry the tears I'd been suppressing. The main waiting area was crowded with anxious families, so I sought out a smaller, quieter space to gather my thoughts before driving. Down a side hallway, I found an empty family consultation room, its door ajar. I slipped inside, sinking gratefully into a padded chair in the corner. Just 5 minutes of quiet, then I'd head home. I must have dozed off momentarily because I startled awake at the sound of voices just outside the door. Confident she has no idea? The voice was unfamiliar, male, professionally modulated. Absolutely none. The second voice sent a jolt through me. Dylan. My husband was just outside the door, speaking in low, measured tones. Heidi's been completely preoccupied with her patient's death. Perfect timing, actually. I froze, suddenly wide awake, my tiredness vanishing like morning mist. Something in Dylan's tone, calculating, cold, held me immobile. The prenup expired after 5 years, Dylan continued. We're coming up on year 6, which means I'm entitled to half of everything. The house has appreciated nicely. And you're certain about the inheritance situation? The first man asked. Heidi has no family money, Dylan replied, a dismissive edge to his voice. Her parents left her nothing but debt. And this caregiver job of hers barely covers her own expenses. The house is the only asset worth fighting for. I pressed a hand to my mouth, stifling the gasp that threatened to escape. This couldn't be happening. Not today of all days. The timing is delicate, the second man cautioned. Courts don't look favorably on divorcing a spouse who's grieving. That's why I need your advice, Kurt. I've been planning this exit for months. Her old lady finally died this morning. Once the funeral's over, I want to file immediately. The business can't wait any longer. I need capital, and my half of the house equity would solve everything. My vision blurred, the room seeming to tilt around me. Dylan's business, his struggling architectural firm, had been the justification for so many sacrifices over the years. We'd cut vacations, delayed starting a family, pinched pennies while I worked extra hours to support his dream. And all this time. Just wait until after the funeral, Kurt advised. Let her process her grief a bit, then we'll file. You don't want to look heartless. Judges are still human. The timing is actually perfect, Dylan said, his voice taking on an animated quality I hadn't heard in months. She's emotionally vulnerable right now. Probably won't have the energy to fight for more than her fair share. And you're sure there's nothing else? No surprises? Kurt asked. Dylan laughed softly, the sound like breaking glass in my ears. What could there be? She's a home health aide who spends her life caring for dying people. There's nothing else to consider. Their voices began to fade as they moved down the hallway. I sat frozen, my fingers gripping the armrests, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The husband I had supported through years of career uncertainty, whose dreams I had prioritized above my own, had just revealed himself to be a stranger, calculating, opportunistic, waiting for the perfect moment to discard me. Mrs. Lillian's envelope suddenly felt heavy in my purse. Her final words echoed in my mind. Your husband doesn't see your worth. How had she seen what I had been so determined to ignore? Through the haze of shock, a thought surfaced, clear, precise, unexpected. Mrs. Lillian's attorney, the meeting she had insisted I arrange, the letter I had only skimmed. With trembling fingers, I pulled out the envelope and fully read its contents for the first time. The words blurred through my tears, but the message was unmistakable. Mrs. Lillian, who had no living relatives, had named me as her sole heir. The Victorian house, her investment portfolio, her photography collection, All of it now belonged to me. The estate's estimated value, $4 million. Dylan had no idea. He was planning to divorce me, to take half of our modest house, leaving me emotionally and financially devastated, all while a fortune, one I had never anticipated or sought, waited for me with Mr. Jackson Pierce, attorney at law. I pressed the letter to my chest, a wild, inappropriate laugh threatening to bubble up through my tears. The absurdity of it. My husband plotting my financial ruin in a hospital hallway on the very day I had inherited millions. I stood on shaky legs, tucking the letter back into my purse. In the restroom across the hall, I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection, a woman I barely recognized, with shadows under her eyes and a new hardness around her mouth. But in those eyes, something was shifting, shock giving way to clarity, grief mingling with resolve. The woman who had entered this hospital hours ago, weighed down by loss and seeking comfort from a husband who wasn't coming, was not the same woman who would walk out. Everything had changed in the span of a conversation never meant for my ears. As I left the hospital and walked to my car, a plan was already forming, not born of vengeance, but of self-preservation. Dylan wanted a financially vulnerable, emotionally exhausted wife who wouldn't fight back. He had no idea who he was really dealing with. By morning, I would be sitting in Jackson Pierce's office, learning the details of my inheritance. And Dylan would still be plotting, completely unaware that his perfect timing had become the perfect irony. I barely remember the drive home from the hospital. The roads blurred through my tears as memories cascaded through my mind, not just of Dylan, but of everything that had led me to this moment. I'd met Dylan Reynolds during my second year as a home health aide. He was designing an accessibility renovation for one of my elderly clients, Mr. Winters, who needed his century-old home modified after a stroke. I'd been impressed by Dylan's patience, the way he'd taken time to understand Mr. Winters's specific needs rather than applying a one-size-fits-all approach. "You really listened to him," I'd commented one afternoon as we both left the Winters residence. "Most contractors just nod and then do whatever they'd planned anyway." Dylan had smiled, that warm, slightly crooked smile that would later become my North Star. "People know what they need better than I ever could. My job is just to translate that into architecture." He'd asked me to coffee that day, and I'd accepted, charmed by his thoughtfulness and the passionate way he spoke about design as a form of care. 2 weeks later, we had our first real date, a picnic in the botanical gardens where he sketched the greenhouse structure while we talked about our dreams. Dylan came from a family of builders, his father a contractor, his grandfather a carpenter. Creating spaces where life happens, he'd called it, a family tradition he was elevating through his architectural education. He'd just opened his own small firm, taking on modest renovation projects while dreaming of designing buildings that would add beauty to the world. I'd fallen in love with that dream as much as with the man. My own background couldn't have been more different. I was raised by practical parents who viewed career choices through the lens of stability rather than passion. My father worked for the Postal Service for 40 years. My mother was a school secretary. They both died within a year of each other shortly after I finished my certification program. My father from a heart attack, my mother from complications of diabetes. They left behind a small house burdened by medical debts and reverse mortgage. Loans, nothing to inherit but painful memories and paperwork. Becoming a caregiver hadn't been my childhood ambition. I'd started college with vague plans of teaching or perhaps nursing, but when my mother's health declined during my sophomore year, I'd left school to help care for her. Those months of measuring medications, coordinating doctor visits, and providing daily support had revealed a talent I hadn't known I possessed, the ability to bring dignity and comfort to vulnerable people. After my mother died, I'd completed a certification program and discovered that end-of-life care was where I felt most useful. There was something sacred about helping someone navigate their final journey, about creating space for both peace and truth in those precious last moments. "I could never do what you do," Dylan had said early in our relationship. "It takes a special kind of strength to face mortality every day and still remain so light." I'd basked in his admiration then, feeling seen in a way my parents had never managed. They had worried about my career choice, concerned about the emotional toll and limited financial prospects. "You're smart enough to be a doctor, not just a caregiver," my father had insisted, missing the point entirely. But Dylan seemed to understand that my work wasn't a consolation prize or a stepping stone, it was a calling. Or so I'd thought. Our courtship had been a whirlwind, 8 months from first date to proposal. Dylan had designed our wedding rings himself, working with a local jeweler to create bands that nestled together perfectly. "Like us," he'd said, as he slid the ring onto my finger. Made to fit. The first years of our marriage had been sweet, if busy. Dylan's business grew steadily as he built a reputation for thoughtful residential work. I expanded my client list, though Mrs. Lillian remained a constant. We bought our house, a fixer-upper that Dylan saw as both investment and canvas. Evenings and weekends were spent stripping wallpaper, refinishing floors, rebuilding the back deck. We worked side by side, creating our shared vision of home. When had that vision begun to blur? 3 years in, perhaps, when Dylan took on the Meridian project, a small mixed-use development that would be his first ground-up building rather than a renovation. He'd been elated to win the commission, pouring himself into the design with an intensity that left little room for our relationship. I'd supported him completely, taking on more clients to help cover our expenses when the project stalled due to permitting issues. "It's just temporary," he'd assured me. "Once Meridian is complete, other developers will notice. This is the stepping stone to everything we've been working toward." But the Meridian project had become a money pit. Construction costs exceeded estimates. The developer made last-minute changes that required extensive redesign. By the time the building was complete, Dylan's firm had barely broken even. The promised stepping stone had become a stumbling block. Other setbacks followed. A recession slowed residential renovation work. A high-profile client backed out of a contract, citing financial concerns. Dylan's confidence eroded with each disappointment. He became defensive about the business, less willing to share details about finances, more insistent that his next project would turn everything around. I'd supported him through it all, emotionally, practically, financially. When my schedule with Mrs. Lillian intensified, requiring more hours and offering less pay, I'd taken on additional weekend clients to maintain my contribution to our household. We'd delayed having children, first because we were establishing our careers, then because the timing never seemed right as Dylan struggled to stabilize his business. Just another year had become our mantra. Just another year until Dylan's firm turned the corner. Just another year until we could start a family. Just another year until we could renovate the kitchen with the custom cabinets Dylan had designed. Just another year of putting my dreams on hold while supporting his. I'd never resented it. That was the painful truth. I'd believed in him, in us, in the partnership we were building. When friends like Elizabeth hinted that the sacrifices seemed one-sided, I'd defended Dylan fiercely. He'd do the same for me if our situations were reversed, I'd insisted. That's what marriage is. Now, sitting in my car in our driveway, engine off but headlights still illuminating the garage door, I confronted the bitter reality. Dylan had never intended to reciprocate. I'd been an investment to him, one that had appreciated nicely, as he'd put it, and was now ripe for liquidation. Just as the housing market was recovering, just as my beloved patient had died, leaving me emotionally vulnerable. Perfect timing. The prenup he'd initially resisted, "We don't need legal documents to define our love," had been a calculated move. He'd known his family's modest assets weren't what needed protection. He'd been playing a longer game, waiting for the 5-year expiration, waiting until our property had appreciated, waiting until he could extract maximum value from our marriage. I thought of the nursery we'd started planning 2 years ago, before Dylan's business troubles intensified. The pale yellow paint samples still tucked in my dresser drawer. The vintage crib I'd found at an estate sale, currently stored in Mrs. Lillian's attic because we don't have space yet. The names we'd discussed late at night, whispering possibilities into the darkness between us. All of it. Every tender moment. Every shared dream. Every promise for our future. Had been part of an elaborate performance. A means to an end. The most devastating part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was realizing how little he must have known me, despite 6 years of marriage. Dylan genuinely believed I was financially naive, emotionally fragile, easily manipulated. He saw me as a doormat, someone who cared for dying people because I lacked the strength or ambition for anything more substantial. He had never understood that my work required more courage, more emotional intelligence, more genuine strength than his ever had. Mrs. Lillian had seen it. Elizabeth had seen it. Why hadn't my own husband? I finally stepped out of the car, the night air cool against my tear-stained face. Our house, the one we'd rebuilt together, the one Dylan now viewed as an asset to be divided, looked different. Somehow. Smaller, less significant, more like a stage set than a home. Inside, all was quiet. Dylan's briefcase sat by the door, his keys in the bowl on the entry table. A half-empty glass of whiskey rested on the kitchen counter beside his laptop. He was home, probably in his office or our bedroom, unaware that his wife had just overheard his exit strategy. I stood in the kitchen, heart pounding, faced with an immediate choice. I could confront him now, unleash the hurt and rage boiling inside me. I could watch his face as he scrambled to explain, to reframe, to manipulate the narrative. Or I could wait, process, plan. Approach this betrayal with the same methodical care I brought to my work with patience. Mrs. Lillian's voice seemed to whisper in my ear. Sometimes the most powerful position is the one where you see everything while remaining unseen. I took a deep breath and made my decision. Quietly, I gathered a few essentials: toothbrush, change of clothes, the letter from Mrs. Lillian. I scribbled a note and left it on the counter. Staying at Mrs. L's house tonight. Need space to process. Don't wait up. It wasn't a lie. I did need space. I did need to process. Just not in the way Dylan would assume. As I slipped out the door, I realized I was still wearing my wedding ring. The custom band Dylan had designed to fit perfectly with his. For a moment, I considered removing it, leaving it behind as a silent statement. But no. That would signal my awareness, my intention. For now, the band stayed on my finger, a reminder of promises made and broken. By tomorrow morning, I would meet with Jackson Pierce. I would understand exactly what Mrs. Lillian had left me and what obligations came with it. And then, with clear eyes and full knowledge, I would decide how to proceed with the husband who had so grievously underestimated me. The drive to Mrs. Lillian's house felt like traveling between worlds. Behind me lay the life I'd built with Dylan. 6 years of marriage, thousands of shared meals, hundreds of inside jokes, countless moments I'd treasured as evidence of our connection. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also a strange sense of liberation, as if I'd been freed from a role I hadn't realized I was playing. As I pulled into Mrs. Lillian's driveway, memories of Dylan flashed through my mind like scenes from a film I was seeing with new clarity. Our first date had been at the Riverside Cafe, a small place near the hospital where I'd been visiting patients. Dylan had arrived with a sketchbook full of designs, eager to show me the renovation he was planning for a historic downtown building. I'd been charmed by his enthusiasm, the way his eyes lit up when describing how he would preserve the original architectural elements while making the space functional for modern use. Most people just see buildings, he'd said, leaning forward across the table. I see possibilities. I'd been captivated by that vision, not just of architecture, but of life. Dylan approached the world as a place to be shaped, improved, designed. It was so different from my work, where I often helped people navigate decline and loss with grace, finding beauty in acceptance rather than transformation. Our courtship progressed quickly. Dylan was confident, decisive, full of plans for our future. He'd take me to construction sites on weekends, proudly showing off his projects. I'd bring him to meet my favorite patients, touched by how easily he charmed them with stories of buildings and design. "He's a keeper," Mrs. Lillian had said after meeting him for the first time. "But watch that ambition of his. Make sure it includes you." I'd laughed off her concern. Dylan's ambition was part of what attracted me. After growing up with parents whose lives were defined by routine and security, his dreams felt expansive, exciting. I wanted to be part of that bigger vision. The proposal came during a weekend trip to the coast. Dylan had designed and built a small wooden box to hold the ring, his grandmother's diamond reset in a modern platinum band. "I want to build a life with you," he'd said, kneeling on the beach at sunset. "A home, a family, a legacy. Will you be my partner in creating something beautiful?" How could I have refused such a poet's invitation? I said yes through happy tears, believing completely in the shared future he described. The early days of our marriage were busy but joyful. We bought our house, a neglected 1930s Tudor with good bones and terrible wallpaper, and spent weekends renovating it together. Dylan taught me to use power tools, to see the potential beneath layers of outdated decor. I taught him patience, the value of preserving certain imperfections that told the home story. "We balance each other," he'd say, his arm around my waist, as we surveyed a newly finished room. I push forward. "You help me appreciate what already exists." Our house became Dylan's showcase, a testament to his design philosophy. He'd bring potential clients over for dinner, using our renovation as evidence of his vision. I'd prepare elaborate meals, play the gracious hostess, support his business ambitions in every way I could. The first subtle shift came 3 years into our marriage, when Dylan was passed over for a major commercial project. He'd been confident about winning the commission, had already sketched preliminary designs, talked about hiring additional staff. When the call came that they'd chosen a more established firm, something changed in him. They were looking for the safe choice, not the best one, he'd said, his voice tight with disappointment. "This town is built on connections, not talent." I'd tried to comfort him, to remind him of his other successes, but he'd pulled away, spending late nights in his home office redesigning the proposal, as if proving to himself what the clients had missed. It was the first time I'd felt him create distance between us, using work as a buffer against vulnerability. More disappointments followed. The housing market slowed, reducing demand for the high-end renovations that had been his specialty. A client ran into financial troubles and couldn't pay the final installment on a major project. Dylan took on smaller jobs to keep the business afloat, but I could see how it wounded his pride. "This isn't what I went to school for," he'd mutter, while drafting plans for kitchen updates and bathroom renovations. "I should be designing buildings that matter, not picking out tile patterns for rich people's guest bathrooms." I suggested he consider teaching architecture part-time to supplement his income while pursuing more meaningful projects. "You have so much to offer students," I'd said, "and it might connect you with new opportunities." He'd dismissed the idea immediately. "I'm a designer, not a teacher. I just need one significant project to turn things around." As financial pressures mounted, our conversations about starting a family were repeatedly postponed. "We can't afford a child right now," Dylan would say whenever I brought it up. "Let's wait until the business is more stable." I was 32, then 33, then 34. The biological clock wasn't just ticking, it was sounding alarms. But Dylan's business always took precedence, his dreams overshadowing mine, until I began to forget I had separate aspirations at all. When Mrs. Lillian's health began to decline more seriously, requiring more of my time and reducing my income, the tension between us escalated. Dylan suggested I find more lucrative clients or consider administrative work at a hospital. "You're too talented to be changing bedpans for minimum wage," he'd said during one particularly heated discussion. "We need to think strategically about our future." "Mrs. Lillian needs me," I'd responded, "and my work isn't just about money." He'd given me a look I couldn't quite interpret, frustration mixed with something else. Calculation, perhaps. "Everything is about money eventually, Heidi. Even caring." The comment had stung, but I'd attributed it to stress, to the pressure he felt trying to keep his business viable. I'd taken on weekend shifts with other clients to compensate for the reduced income from Mrs. Lillian, working 60-hour weeks while still maintaining our home, supporting Dylan emotionally, playing the role of perfect wife whenever clients came to dinner. Our physical relationship changed too, becoming less frequent, more perfunctory. Dylan claimed exhaustion, stress, late-night work sessions. I accepted these explanations, too tired myself to press the issue, too afraid of the answers I might receive if I questioned too deeply. Last Christmas, Dylan had given me a small velvet box. Inside was a pendant, not expensive but thoughtfully chosen, a delicate silver compass. "To remind you that no matter where life takes us, we'll always find our way back to each other," he'd said, fastening it around my neck. I'd worn it every day since, taking comfort in its symbolism even as our marriage seemed increasingly adrift. Now, sitting in Mrs. Lillian's driveway, I reached up to touch the compass pendant, still hanging at my throat. The irony was bitter, a symbol of direction from a man who had been secretly plotting his exit, a token of connection from someone who saw me as nothing more than a financial transaction to be completed. I unclasped the necklace, holding the small silver compass in my palm. It caught the moonlight, the arrow pointing steadily north while my life spun off its axis. With sudden decision, I placed it in the glove compartment. Whatever guided me forward from this point, it wouldn't be Dylan's false promises. Inside Mrs. Lillian's house, I moved through darkened rooms, turning on just enough lights to navigate. The hospice bed in the sunroom was empty now, the medical equipment already removed. Only Mrs. Lillian's personal touches remained: the quilt, the framed photographs on the wall, the small collection of treasured books on the side table. I made my way to the guest room that had become a second home during the past months. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I finally allowed myself to fully process what I'd overheard. Dylan had been planning for months to leave me, while I'd been caring for Mrs. Lillian, supporting his business, maintaining our home, and postponing my own dreams. He'd been calculating the optimal moment to discard me. Had there been signs? Looking back, I could see them clearly. His increasing secretiveness about finances, his late nights away from home, his emotional distance, his subtle criticisms of my career, the weekend trips for client meetings that left him unavailable by phone. The browser history hastily cleared when I borrowed his laptop. The unexplained credit card charges to restaurants where we'd never dined together. Perhaps most telling was the shift in how he spoke about my work. In the beginning, he'd seemed to respect and admire my commitment to end-of-life care. "What you do matters," he'd said once, after meeting a patient's grateful family. "You make the hardest time in people's lives a little more bearable." But, gradually, that admiration had eroded, replaced by thinly veiled disdain. My career became that little nursing job or your volunteer work. My patients became those dying people you're so attached to. My emotional investment became unprofessional rather than compassionate. "You need to create better boundaries," he'd advised after finding me in tears following a particularly difficult patient death. "You can't take on everyone else's grief." What I'd interpreted as concern for my well-being now revealed itself as contempt for what he perceived as weakness. Dylan valued ambition, success, forward momentum. My work with the dying, helping them find peace with endings rather than striving for new beginnings, was fundamentally at odds with his worldview. And yet, he'd married me. Had he seen something in me initially that he grew to despise? Or had I been a project from the beginning, a supportive wife to renovate and improve, just like our house? I reached for my phone, scrolling through recent photos of us together. Dylan's smile looked genuine in these captured moments, his arm around my shoulders at his colleague's wedding, his eyes meeting mine across our anniversary dinner table. Had all of it been performance? Was it possible to fake connection so convincingly for so long? My wedding ring caught the light as I set the phone down. The custom-designed band that Dylan had been so proud of, that I'd treasured as a symbol of our unique bond. I twisted it off, surprised by how easily it slipped from my finger, how light it felt in my palm. 6 years of marriage, reduced to a few grams of precious metal. I placed the ring on the nightstand and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring decisions, actions, the first steps toward whatever came next. Tonight was for acknowledging the truth in all its painful clarity. The relationship I had devoted myself to had been built on sand. The husband I had loved was a stranger, and the life I had constructed with such care had been a carefully maintained illusion. The tears, when they finally came, were not for what I was losing, but for what had never existed in the first place. Sleep eluded me that night in Mrs. Lillian's guest room. As I lay awake, staring at the shadows playing across the ceiling, my mind methodically catalogued all the warnings I had dismissed, all the red flags I had explained away, all the moments when instinct had whispered caution only to be silenced by love and loyalty. The first warning had come from my father, of all people. When I introduced Dylan to my parents shortly before their deaths, my practical, undemonstrative father had pulled me aside afterward. "He's very smooth, your architect," he'd said, his tone carefully neutral. "Make sure you know what's behind that polish." I'd bristled at the comment, defensive of my brilliant, charming boyfriend. "You just don't like that he has ambition," I'd retorted. "Not everyone wants to work the same job for 40 years. The hurt that flashed across my father's face still haunted me. He'd been trying to protect me, drawing on decades of observing human nature through his postal counter window. "Just make sure he loves you more than he loves success," he'd said finally. "That's all I'm asking." I hadn't listened. I'd been too enchanted by Dylan's dreams, too flattered by his attention, too eager to escape the practical world my parents represented. Another warning had come during our wedding planning, when Dylan insisted on avoiding a prenuptial agreement despite his family's pressure. "My parents are traditional," he'd explained. "They believe marriage is forever, not a business arrangement. I agree with them." At the time, I'd found his stance romantic, a testament to his faith in our relationship. Now I recognized the calculation behind it. My parents had recently died, leaving me with no assets but freedom from their modest debts thanks to a small life insurance policy. Dylan's family, while not wealthy, had some property and investments. A prenup would have protected their assets from me, but also limited his access to anything I might acquire during our marriage. "The 5-year limit was your idea," I whispered to the darkness. Dylan had suggested that if we absolutely had to have a prenuptial agreement to appease his family, it should expire after 5 years. "Once we've proven this is forever." I'd agreed, touched by what seemed like a romantic compromise. The warning signs had multiplied after we bought our house. Dylan had insisted my name be on the mortgage alongside his, despite my lower income and less stable employment. "We're partners," he'd said. "Equal in everything." What had seemed like progressive thinking about marriage now revealed itself as financial strategy. With my name on the mortgage, I was equally responsible for the payments. Payments that became increasingly difficult as Dylan's business struggled and my hours with Mrs. Lillian increased. Yet he'd resisted when I suggested downsizing to something more manageable. This house is an investment, he'd argued. Property in this neighborhood only appreciates. We need to think long-term. Long-term for the house, perhaps, but not for our marriage. The irony was bitter. Then there was the gradual isolation from my support network. Nothing dramatic. Dylan never forbade me from seeing friends or maintaining relationships. His methods were subtler. He'd express exhaustion whenever Elizabeth invited us to dinner. He'd schedule client meetings that mysteriously coincided with my family gatherings. He'd make cutting remarks about my colleagues' life choices, creating an atmosphere where bringing them into our home felt uncomfortable. Wouldn't you rather have a quiet night just us? He'd ask. We both work so hard. Our time together is precious. Flattered by his apparent desire for my company, I'd cancel plans, decline invitations, gradually letting friendships fade into occasional text exchanges and coffee dates squeezed between work commitments. Only Elizabeth had persisted, refusing to be sidelined, continuing to check in even when I went weeks without responding. Mrs. Lillian had seen it too. 6 months ago, during a lucid period between pain medication doses, she'd fixed me with that photographer's gaze that seemed to capture everything. He's isolating you, she'd said flatly. It's what they do before they leave. Make sure you have no safety net. I'd laughed nervously. Dylan's not they, Mrs. Lillian. He's just busy with work. We both are. She'd reached for my hand, her paper-thin skin cool against mine. I watched my sister's husband do the same thing. By the time he left, she had no one to turn to. Don't let that happen to you, Heidi. I'd dismissed her concern as the paranoia of age or the projection of her sister's experience onto my very different marriage. Now, I wondered if her lifetime of observing people through a camera lens had given her insights I'd been too close to see. The financial warning signs had been perhaps the most glaring. 2 years ago, Dylan had suggested combining our bank accounts to simplify our finances. I'd agreed, believing it represented deeper commitment. Instead, it had given him complete visibility into my earnings while creating a fog around his. Business expenses, client dinners, professional memberships, all were explained away with vague references to investing in the firm's future. When I'd asked to review our finances, together last year concerned about making ends meet, Dylan had become defensive. Don't you trust me? He'd asked, wounded. I'm doing everything I can to keep this family afloat while you work for practically nothing with that old woman. The conversation had ended with me apologizing for questioning his management of our money. I'd picked up weekend shifts with new clients to contribute more, further exhausting myself while Dylan maintained control. Perhaps the most painful missed warning had come just 3 months ago, when I'd found a brochure for vasectomy, procedures in Dylan's desk drawer while searching for stamps. When confronted, he'd claimed it was for a friend seeking information. Why would Julian ask you to get medical brochures? I'd asked, puzzled. He's embarrassed, Dylan had explained smoothly. Doesn't want Mary to know he's considering it until he's made a decision. I'd accepted the explanation, even feeling guilty for invading his privacy. Now I wondered if Dylan had already decided our marriage had no future, had already determined that children with me were not in his plans. While I waited patiently for the right time to start our family, he'd been ensuring that time would never come. All these moments, these warnings, hesitations, and red flags had been buried beneath the weight of my commitment to our marriage, my belief in Dylan's fundamental goodness, my certainty that what we were building together was real and worthwhile. Elizabeth had tried to reach through my denial just weeks ago. When was the last time Dylan made a sacrifice for you? She'd asked during our monthly coffee. Relationships should be reciprocal, Heidi. It can't always be you accommodating his dreams. I'd defended him automatically. He sacrifices every day, working to build something for our future. Her raised eyebrow had spoken volumes, but she'd dropped the subject, unwilling to push harder against my protective wall. I'd been so determined not to see the truth. I'd built barricades against anyone who tried to show it to me. As dawn light began to filter through the guest room curtains, I faced the painful reality. I had not been blindsided. I had been willfully blind, interpreting red flags as romantic gestures, seeing devotion to career as commitment to our shared future, mistaking strategic positioning for partnership. I had wanted so badly to believe in the marriage I thought we had that I'd ignored every sign pointing to the marriage we actually did. The realization didn't bring anger, not yet. First came a profound sadness for the woman I had been, so eager to support someone else's dreams that she'd forgotten to protect her own heart. I must have dozed off as the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, because I woke with a start to my phone buzzing insistently. The screen showed 3 missed calls from Dylan and a text message. "Where are you? Came home late. Found your note. Are you okay?" For a moment, disorientation clouded my thoughts. Then the events of the previous day crashed back. Mrs. Lillian's death, the conversation overheard in the hospital, the shattering of illusions. I set the phone aside without responding, not yet ready to engage in what would inevitably be another performance. Instead, I called the number on Jackson Pierce's business card. To my surprise, he answered despite the early hour. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said when I identified myself. "I've been expecting your call. Mrs. Montgomery was quite insistent that I make myself available whenever you reached out. My condolences on your loss." His voice was warm, professional, unexpectedly kind. "I need to understand exactly what Mrs. Lillian's arrangements are," I said, my own voice steady despite the emotional turbulence beneath. "Can I see you today?" "Of course. I can fit you in at 9 a.m. if that works for you." I agreed, relieved at the prospect of answers, of solid ground amid the quicksand of my personal life. After hanging up, I sent Dylan a brief text. "At Mrs. L's house. Meeting with her attorney this morning about final arrangements. We'll call later." It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the complete truth. After a quick shower and change into clothes I kept at Mrs. Lillian's for overnight stays, I made coffee in her kitchen, the familiar routine providing small comfort. As I waited for the appropriate time to leave for my appointment, I found myself drawn to Mrs. Lillian's study, the room where she had organized her life's work, where she had instructed me to find that fateful envelope. The space was quintessentially her, orderly but personal, functional but beautiful. Photographs lined the walls, capturing moments of history alongside more intimate portraits. Her desk, an antique roll top that had belonged to her father, contained neatly labeled folders documenting her business affairs, correspondence, and the meticulous notes she'd taken throughout her career. With a pang, I realized that organizing this room, preserving her legacy, would now fall to me. Whether I was truly her heir or simply the executor of her estate, I owed her the care and attention she had brought to her life's work. One photograph in particular caught my eye. Mrs. Lillian herself, much younger, standing on a battlefield, somewhere in Southeast Asia. She wasn't looking at the camera, but instead gazing slightly to the side, her expression a complex mixture of determination and vulnerability. It was a self-portrait, I realized, taken with equipment visible in the corner of the frame. Even while documenting others, she had found a way to document herself, to assert her presence in the narrative. The image stirred something in me, a reminder that we are all both observers and participants in our own stories. I had spent years observing Dylan's life, supporting his narrative, while failing to assert my own presence, my own needs, and dreams. That would change, starting today. Jackson Pierce's office was located in a converted Victorian home in the historic district, its exterior maintaining period charm, while the interior had been modernized into efficient professional spaces. The attorney himself matched his surroundings, traditional in appearance with his gray suit and wire-rimmed glasses, but sharp and contemporary in manner. "Mrs. Montgomery spoke of you often and with great affection," he said after I'd settled into a chair across from his desk. "She was quite specific about her wishes regarding your inheritance." "I still don't understand why she would leave anything to me," I admitted. "I was her caregiver, not family." Pierce smiled gently. "Mrs. Montgomery had no biological family left. Her husband died 20 years ago and they had no children. Her siblings predeceased her. In her view, family was something chosen rather than merely inherited through blood." He opened a file folder, removing a document bearing Mrs. Lillian's distinctive signature. "This is her last will and testament, updated 6 months ago when her health began to decline more rapidly. The terms are quite straightforward. As her sole heir, you inherit her entire estate, which includes her home and its contents, her investment portfolio, the rights to her photography collection, and various other financial assets." "And the total value?" I asked, still trying to absorb the reality of what he was telling me. "Approximately $4 million, he replied. "The house itself is valued at just over $1 million, given its historic status and prime location. Her investment portfolio is conservative, but has performed consistently well over decades, currently valued at approximately $2 million. The photography collection has been appraised at $700,000, though its cultural value arguably exceeds its market value. The remainder consists of cash accounts, a small art collection, and personal items." The figures washed over me like waves, too large to fully comprehend. $4 million. Financial independence. Freedom from the constraints that had shaped my choices for years. Freedom from Dylan's calculation that I would be left vulnerable and dependent after Mrs. Lillian's death. "There must be conditions," I said, searching for the catch, the strings that must be attached to such generosity. Pierce shook his head. "Mrs. Montgomery was quite clear that there are no conditions. The estate is yours to use as you see fit. She did express a hope that you would consider preserving her photographic legacy in some form, but that is a wish, not a requirement." He handed me another document. "This is the deed to the house, which has already been transferred to your name. Mrs. Montgomery completed this process 3 months ago, utilizing a special provision that allowed for the transfer while avoiding certain tax implications. She was quite determined to ensure your inheritance would be as uncomplicated as possible." "Why didn't she tell me?" I asked, the question that had been circling in my mind since reading her letter. Why keep this secret until after she was gone? Pierce's expression softened. "She said you might ask that. Her words, not mine. Heidi would have tried to refuse it. She cares for me out of love, not expectation of reward. That's precisely why she deserves everything I can give her." Tears welled in my eyes at this final evidence of how well Mrs. Lillian had known me, how clearly she had seen me when others, including my own husband, had failed to truly look. "There's something else," Pierce continued, his tone shifting slightly. "Something Mrs. Montgomery asked me to tell you directly, rather than including it in her letter or legal documents." I waited, curious and slightly apprehensive. "She was concerned about your marriage," he said carefully. "In the last months of her life, she shared observations that troubled her. She never met your husband, but based on conversations with you and changes she noticed in your behavior over time, she developed significant concerns. This was unexpected. Mrs. Lillian had occasionally made oblique comments about Dylan, but I had no idea she had spoken to her attorney about him." "What kind of concerns?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "She believed he was demonstrating patterns consistent with financial exploitation," Pierce said directly. "Increasing isolation, erosion of self-confidence, redirection of resources. She wanted to ensure that this inheritance would be protected as your separate property, not marital assets subject to division." The attorney's clinical description matched perfectly with what I had overheard in the hospital: the calculated timing, the assumption of my vulnerability, the planned division of assets. Mrs. Lillian had seen it all from a distance, through the lens of experience and careful observation, while I had been too close, too involved, too invested to recognize the pattern. Mrs. Montgomery asked me to tell you that if her concerns proved unfounded, no harm would be done by taking precautions. But if they proved accurate? He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. She wanted you to know that she had created for you what she called an exit strategy with dignity. An exit strategy. The phrase echoed in my mind, practical and unsentimental, just like Mrs. Lillian herself. She hadn't simply left me money. She had left me options, choices, the freedom to determine my own path forward without financial pressure forcing my decisions. What do I need to do next? I asked, my mind suddenly clear, focused on practical steps rather than emotional turmoil. Pierce outlined the immediate actions required: financial accounts to be transferred, decisions about the house, considerations regarding the photography, collection. As he spoke, a plan began to form in my mind. Not reactive, but strategic. Dylan had been planning for months. Now I would plan too, but with resources he couldn't begin to imagine. One last thing, Pierce said as our meeting concluded. Mrs. Montgomery left this for you. He handed me a small wooden box, intricately carved with a pattern of leaves and vines. She said you would understand its significance. I recognized it immediately. A box that had sat on Mrs. Lillian's bedside table throughout her illness, one she would often touch but rarely open. Inside was a single item, a vintage Leica camera, small but perfectly maintained. Her first professional camera, I whispered, running my fingers over the worn leather case. She told me she used this to take the photographs that launched her career. Pierce nodded. She said to tell you, it's time to start capturing your own story, not just witnessing others. As I left the attorney's office, the camera in my purse, and a folder of documents tucked under my arm, I felt a shift in my perspective, as if I had stepped behind the viewfinder rather than remaining the subject of someone else's composition. For years, I had been framed by Dylan's ambitions, positioned according to his vision of our life together. Now I was the one with my finger on the shutter, deciding what to capture, what to include in the frame, what story to tell. My phone buzzed with another text from Dylan. Getting worried. Please call me. For the first time, I could see his concern. For what it truly was. Not love, but fear of losing control of the narrative, of losing control of me. I didn't call. Instead, I drove back to Mrs. Lillian's house, my house now, and began to make plans. Back at Mrs. Lillian's house, my house now, I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, suddenly overcome by the weight of everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. My knees gave way, and I slid down to sit on the floor, Mrs. Lillian's camera clutched to my chest, tears finally breaking free after hours of pragmatic focus. Grief came in waves, not just for Mrs. Lillian, though her absence created a hollow space in my world that nothing could immediately fill. I grieved for the marriage I thought I had, for the years invested in a relationship built on sand, for the children Dylan and I would never have, for the dreams I had postponed in service to his ambitions. Most painful was grieving for the version of my husband I had believed in, the supportive partner, the creative dreamer, the man who saw my work as meaningful rather than merely convenient for his plans. My body responded physically to the emotional upheaval. My chest tightened until breathing became difficult. My hands trembled so violently I had to set the camera aside. Nausea rolled through me in waves, sending me stumbling to the nearest bathroom. After emptying what little was in my stomach, I sat on the cool tile floor, pressing my forehead against the bathtub's porcelain edge, seeking relief from the heat that seemed to radiate from within. This wasn't just sadness or disappointment. It was trauma. the sudden, violent rupture of my understanding of reality. Everything I had believed about my life, my marriage, my future had been revealed as fiction. The ground beneath my feet had disappeared, leaving me in free fall. I don't know how long I sat there, time losing meaning as emotions crashed through me unchecked. Eventually, practicality reasserted itself, the caregiver's instinct to attend to physical needs even in emotional crisis. I rinsed my mouth, splashed cold water on my face, and made my way to the kitchen for water and whatever simple food I could manage. As I moved through the house, Mrs. Lillian's house, my house, the surroundings both comforted and disoriented me. I knew every object, every photograph, every book on the shelves. I had dusted these surfaces, arranged flowers in these vases, adjusted these curtains to let in just the right amount of light for Mrs. Lillian's sensitive eyes. Yet now these familiar things existed in a new context. They were mine. I was responsible for them, not as a caregiver but as an owner. Just as my marriage had transformed overnight from partnership to transaction, my relationship to this house had shifted from professional to personal in the blink of an eye. My phone continued to buzz with messages and calls from Dylan. Eventually, I knew I would need to respond, to begin the careful performance that would buy me time and space to make decisions, but not yet. Not while I was still raw, still vulnerable, still processing the seismic shift in my reality. Instead, I found myself drawn to Mrs. Lillian's bedroom. Unlike the sunroom where she had spent her final months, this space had remained largely unchanged. From her active years, elegant, organized, deeply personal. Her scent still lingered faintly. The lavender sachets she tucked among her clothes, the rose water she dabbed on her wrists even in illness. I sat on the edge of her bed, running my hand over the handmade quilt she had told me stories about, each square representing a different assignment in her photojournalism career, sewn during long evenings in hotel rooms around the world. The tangible connection to her eased something in my chest, allowing me to breathe more deeply. On her nightstand sat a small framed photograph I had always loved. Mrs. Lillian with her husband Emmett in Paris, both young and laughing, her camera hanging around her neck. They looked so happy, so connected. Their marriage had lasted until his death 40 years later. "How did you know?" I whispered to her image. "How did you know what he really was when I couldn't see it myself?" My gaze fell on her bookshelves, filled with volumes on photography, technique, art history, and biographies of remarkable women. One title caught my eye, a book I had never noticed before, perhaps recently added or simply overlooked. Wolves in Sheep's Clothing, Recognizing Financial Predators. A bookmark protruded from its pages. With trembling fingers, I pulled it from the shelf and opened to the marked page. A passage was highlighted in Mrs. Lillian's precise hand. Financial predators often target caregivers and helping professionals, recognizing that their natural empathy and tendency toward self-sacrifice make them vulnerable to exploitation. The caregiver's ability to prioritize others' needs, usually a strength, becomes a liability when manipulated by someone who presents initial appreciation for this quality, only to gradually reframe it as weakness. The words struck with physical force. This wasn't just general wisdom. This was me, specifically and precisely. Mrs. Lillian had been researching, trying to understand what she observed in my marriage, preparing to protect me even when I couldn't protect myself. I flipped through more pages, finding additional highlighted sections about isolation techniques, financial control mechanisms, and the calculated timing of abandonment. Each description matched Dylan's behavior with unsettling accuracy. This wasn't a coincidence or a misinterpretation of normal marital tensions. This was a recognized pattern, a strategy, a predatory approach that Mrs. Lillian had identified from her vantage point of age and experience. "Oh, Mrs. Lillian," I whispered, clutching the book to my chest. "You were trying to warn me all along." Anger, began to rise then, breaking through the initial shock and grief. Not just at Dylan, though that would come in full force, but at myself. How had I been so blind? How had I rationalized so many red flags, dismissed so many warnings, ignored my own instincts for so long? I thought of every time I'd defended Dylan to Elizabeth, every time I'd explained away his increasingly cold behavior as stress or business, pressure, every time I'd worked extra shifts to contribute more financially while he maintained complete control over our resources. I thought of the prenuptial agreement with its convenient 5-year expiration, the house with my name on the mortgage but his vision stamped on every room, the gradually increasing isolation from friends and family who might have helped me see the truth. I'd been complicit in my own exploitation, believing so completely in the partnership I thought we had that I couldn't recognize the transaction it had become, or perhaps had always been. The grief and anger twisted together, forming something new, determination. Not yet a plan. Not yet even clarity about what I wanted beyond this moment, but a bedrock certainty that I would not continue to be a pawn in Dylan's game. That the narrative he had constructed, with me as the convenient supporting character to be written out when no longer useful, was not the story I would allow to unfold. My phone buzzed again. Dylan. Again. This time, I picked up. Heidi? His voice held what sounded like genuine concern. Where have you been? I've been worried sick. For a moment, the familiar sound of his voice nearly pulled me back into our shared fiction. The devoted husband, the grieving wife, the supportive partnership, weathering a difficult time. It would be so easy to slide back into that role, to pretend I hadn't heard his true plans, to buy myself time while maintaining the illusion. But Mrs. Lillian's highlighted book lay open beside me, its truths undeniable. And her final gift, financial, independence, had freed me from the need to play along with his deception. I'm at Mrs. Lillian's house, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I needed some time alone after she passed. I understand, he said softly. But you should come. Home now? Let me take care of you during this difficult time. The word home hung between us, its meaning suddenly uncertain. The house we had shared was no longer home, perhaps had never truly been. This house, with its memories of Mrs. Lillian, its evidence of her care for me, felt more like home in this moment than the carefully designed space I had occupied with Dylan for 6 years. I'm meeting with her attorney, I said, neither confirming nor denying that I would return. There are arrangements to make. Do you want me to come? Help with the paperwork? He offered, the perfect supportive husband. I could reschedule my afternoon appointments. No, I replied, perhaps too quickly. I can handle it. A pause, barely perceptible but telling. Okay, just keep me updated. And Heidi, I love you. We'll get through this together. The words that once would have comforted me now rang hollow. A performance for an audience he didn't realize had seen behind the curtain. I couldn't bring myself to return the sentiment. I'll call you later, I said instead, and ended the call. Setting. The phone down, I picked up Mrs. Lillian's camera again, feeling its weight, its substance, its history. Through this lens, she had captured truth that others missed, had documented reality rather than performance, had created a legacy that would outlive her physical presence. Perhaps it was time, as her note suggested, for me to do the same, to see clearly, to document truthfully, to create something authentic from the ruins of illusion. I just needed to figure out what that looked like. And more immediately, how to navigate the dangerous waters ahead with a husband who didn't yet know I had seen behind his mask. The afternoon light slanted through Mrs. Lillian's, my windows, casting long shadows across the oriental rug in the living room. I sat at her writing desk, a legal pad before me, attempting to organize my thoughts into some semblance of a plan. The phone call with Dylan had crystallized something for me. I needed to make decisions, not just react to circumstances. Two paths stretched before me, each with its own risks and potential rewards. I could confront Dylan immediately with what I'd overheard, laying my cards on the table and forcing an end to his deception. The emotional satisfaction of seeing his face when he realized his careful planning had been exposed was tempting. I imagined the shock, the scrambling for explanations, the collapse of his calculated facade. But confrontation carried risks. Dylan might become desperate if cornered, might lash out legally or emotionally, might find ways to make the divorce even more painful than it already promised to be. And confrontation would require immediate emotional resources. I wasn't sure. I possessed. The wound was too fresh, the betrayal too raw for me to trust myself to navigate that conversation strategically rather than reactively. The second path was more calculated. I could play along temporarily, pretending ignorance of his plans while securing my position legally and financially. This approach would buy me time to consult with my own divorce attorney, to understand exactly how Mrs. Lillian's inheritance might be protected, to make arrangements that would ensure my long-term security before the inevitable confrontation occurred. This path required its own kind of strength, the ability to return home to Dylan, to maintain a convincing performance of normalcy, to sleep beside a man I now knew had been plotting against me for months. Could I do that? Could I look into the eyes of the husband I had loved and not reveal that I now saw him clearly for perhaps the first time? I thought of Mrs. Lillian, of her career photographing conflict zones and political upheavals. She had maintained her composure in situations far more dangerous than the one I faced, had kept her camera steady while documenting atrocities and injustices, had found ways to reveal truth without immediately exposing herself to retaliation. Perhaps I could channel some of that strength, that strategic patience. My legal pad remained stubbornly empty, the decision too consequential to commit too hastily. As evening approached, I found myself drawn to Mrs. Lillian's photography studio at the back of the house, a space I had rarely entered during her illness, as her declining strength had made professional work impossible in her final years. The room remained exactly as she had left it, dust covers protecting her equipment, portfolios carefully labeled and stored on metal shelving units, a large desk positioned beneath windows angled to capture northern light. This had been her sanctuary, her creative space, the place where she transformed raw images into compelling narratives. On the wall hung one of her most famous photographs, a series of 3 images showing a young refugee woman crossing a border checkpoint. In the first, the woman's face showed fear. In the second, determination. In the third, relief at having reached safety. Mrs. Lillian had explained to me once how she had positioned herself to capture that sequence, how she had anticipated the emotional journey before it unfolded, how she had prepared for the moment rather than simply reacting to it. The difference between an amateur and a professional, she'd told me, isn't talent or even technique. It's preparation. Understanding what might happen before it does, and being ready when it does. Those words resonated now as I contemplated my own situation. Dylan had been preparing for months, positioning himself advantageously for the divorce he planned to initiate. If I chose to confront him immediately, I would be reacting emotionally to his calculated strategy, placing myself at an immediate disadvantage. But if I took time to prepare, to understand my options fully, to position myself as strategically as he had positioned himself, I might navigate this dissolution with dignity and security rather than chaos and vulnerability. The answer crystallized with sudden clarity. I would return home, but not yet. I would use tonight to begin my preparations, to contact a divorce attorney of my own, to understand exactly what protections might be available for my inheritance. I would return to Dylan tomorrow with a performance of my own, the grieving caregiver, emotionally fragile but unsuspecting, exactly as he expected me to be. It wasn't confrontation or capitulation. It was strategic patience, Mrs. Lillian's final lesson to me. I reached for my phone, searching for divorce attorneys in our area. One name appeared repeatedly in positive reviews. Mary Ann Slater, described as compassionate but ruthless when necessary, and especially skilled in cases involving financial deception. Her office offered emergency consultations, with early morning appointments available. My fingers hovered over the call button, the finality of this step momentarily overwhelming. Contacting a divorce attorney meant accepting that my marriage was truly over, not just damaged or strained, but fundamentally broken beyond repair. Despite everything I had learned, some small part of me still hesitated, still wondered if there might be an explanation that could transform Dylan's words into something other than the calculated betrayal they appeared to be. I thought of the highlighted book on Mrs. Lillian's shelf, the careful research she had done to understand what she observed in my marriage. I thought of Dylan's voice in the hospital hallway, cool, pragmatic, discussing the perfect timing of my grief as a strategic advantage. I thought of all the warning signs I had ignored, all the red flags I had rationalized, all the moments when instinct had whispered caution only to be silenced by love and loyalty. There was no alternative explanation, no misunderstanding to clarify. This was who Dylan was, perhaps who he had always been beneath the charm and ambition that had so captivated me 6 years ago. I pressed the call button. Mary Ann Slater's assistant answered, and upon hearing the barest outline of my situation, scheduled me for a 7:30 a.m. appointment the following day. "Bring any financial documents you can access without raising suspicion," she advised. "And Ms. Slater suggests you begin keeping a detailed journal of all conversations with your husband." After hanging up, I felt something shift inside me, a weight lifting even as a new kind of heaviness settled in. The decision had been made. I was choosing to protect myself, to advocate for my interests, to approach the end of my marriage with the same careful attention I had brought to its beginning. My phone buzzed with another text from Dylan. "Getting worried, Heidi. Please come home tonight. I can pick you up if you don't feel up to driving." I stared at the screen, at the performance of concern that once would have touched me deeply. Now I saw it for what it was, another move in a game he didn't realize I had discovered we were playing. "Still at Mrs. L's," I texted back. "Need one more night here to process and deal with initial arrangements. We'll be home tomorrow morning. Don't worry about me." His response came quickly. "Whatever you need, babe. I'm here for you. Love you." 3. Simple words that had once meant everything to me. Now they rang hollow, performative, perhaps never having contained the meaning I had invested in them. I set the phone aside and walked through the house, turning on lights as darkness fell. This house, with its history and character, its carefully curated collections and thoughtful design, represented something profound. Not just financial security, but Mrs. Lillian's belief in me. Her recognition of my worth when others, including my husband, had failed to truly see me. In the kitchen, I found a bottle of wine Mrs. Lillian had kept for special occasions. I opened it and poured a glass, carrying it out to the small patio garden where Mrs. Lillian had often sat in the evenings during better days. The spring air held a gentle warmth, birds settling into trees for the night, distant city sounds creating a subtle backdrop to the garden's peace. "I wish you were here," I said aloud, raising my glass to the emerging stars. "But I think you prepared me for this moment better than you knew." As I sipped the wine, my mind continued to work, no longer paralyzed by shock but moving purposefully through practical considerations. I would need to secure important documents, understand our financial entanglements, prepare for the possibility that Dylan might react unpredictably when he realized his plans had been discovered. But beyond those immediate concerns stretched a different kind of consideration. What did I want my life to look like after this necessary ending? What dreams had I set aside that might now be reclaimed? What possibilities might open up once I was no longer bending my life around Dylan's ambitions? For so long, I had defined myself primarily through relationships: caregiver to patients, wife to Dylan, friend to Elizabeth. Mrs. Lillian's inheritance offered not just financial security, but the freedom to discover who I might be when standing fully on my own, making choices based on my own desires rather than others' needs. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. I finished my wine as full darkness settled over the garden. Inside, I found bedsheets in the linen closet and made up the guest room where I had stayed so many nights during Mrs. Lillian's illness. Tomorrow would begin early with the attorney appointment, followed by the return home to begin a performance of my own, the final act of a marriage that had been, perhaps, more performance than substance all along. As I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman who gazed back at me looked different somehow, her eyes clearer, her jaw set with new determination, her shoulders straighter despite the weight they carried. This woman was not a victim but a survivor, not merely reacting to betrayal, but choosing her response with careful consideration. "There you are," I whispered to my reflection, recognizing something that had perhaps been there all along, waiting for circumstances that would bring it to the surface. "There you are." I slept deeply that night, without dreams, my body and mind finally surrendering to exhaustion after the emotional turbulence of the day. When my alarm sounded at 6 a.m., I woke with unprecedented clarity about the path ahead. The decision had been made. Now came the careful, deliberate execution of a plan that would lead not just to the end of my marriage, but to the beginning of whatever came next. As I dressed for my appointment with Marianne Slater, I slipped Mrs. Lillian's vintage Leica camera into my bag. Not because I intended to use it, but as a tangible reminder of the woman who had seen my worth clearly enough to safeguard my future. Whatever came next, I would face it through her lens, with clarity, with purpose, and with the determination to capture my own story rather than merely appearing in someone else's. Marianne Slater's office occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse downtown, its industrial chic aesthetic a stark contrast to the Victorian charm of Mrs. Lillian's home. I arrived 10 minutes early for my 7:30 appointment, clutching a folder containing the few financial documents I had been able to gather. Mrs. Lillian's will, her letter to me, statements from my personal bank account that Dylan didn't know, existed. The attorney herself defied expectations. Neither the stern, suited powerhouse nor the sympathetic maternal figure I had imagined. Instead, Marianne was a compact woman in her 50s with a silver pixie cut, sharp eyes behind stylish glasses, and a direct manner that wasted no time on pleasantries beyond the essential. "So your husband is planning to divorce you after your patient's funeral, believing you'll be financially vulnerable, unaware that you've just inherited approximately $4 million, she summarized after I explained my situation. "And you overheard this discussion between him and his attorney yesterday, the same day your patient died, and you learned of your inheritance." "Yes," I confirmed, still somewhat disoriented by hearing my circumstances outlined so clinically. Marianne nodded, making a brief note. "The timing is almost poetic. Do you have evidence of what you overheard?" "No," I admitted. "I was alone in the waiting room. They had no idea I was there." "Unfortunate, but not critical. What matters now is protecting your inheritance and securing your position before he makes his move." She leaned forward. "Here's what you need to do immediately. Today, before you return home." The list was comprehensive and practical. Open a new bank account at a different institution from any we currently used. Transfer a reasonable amount of cash into it. Gather all important personal documents, birth certificate, passport, social security card, and secure them outside our home. Create a detailed inventory of valuable personal property. Change passwords on all personal email and social media. Accounts. Begin documenting all interactions with Dylan in a journal. noting dates, times, and exact words as much as possible. "What about the inheritance?" I asked. "Can he claim part of it in the divorce?" "Inheritances are generally considered separate property, not marital assets," Marianne explained. "But there are complications. If you commingle the inherited funds with joint accounts or use them to improve marital property, they could be considered partially marital assets. My advice is to keep everything strictly separate until after the divorce is finalized." "He expects me to be devastated by Mrs. Lillian's death," I said slowly. "Emotionally fragile, financially vulnerable. If I start making these moves, won't he realize something's changed?" Marianne's expression was understanding but firm. "That's why you need to be extremely careful about how you proceed. The advantage you have, and it's significant, is that he doesn't know that you know. Use that. Maintain the appearance he expects while quietly securing your position." By the time our consultation ended, I had a clear action plan and a follow-up appointment scheduled for the following week. Marianne's parting advice stayed with me as I left her office. "Remember, Ms. Reynolds, this isn't about vengeance. It's about protection. Every step you take should serve your long-term well-being, not short-term emotional satisfaction." The morning stretched before me, precious hours before I needed to return home and begin my performance as the grieving caregiver, unaware of her husband's betrayal. I used them methodically, crossing items off Marianne's list with quiet efficiency. At a bank across town, I opened a new account, transferring funds from my personal savings, not enough to raise immediate alarms, but sufficient to provide a financial cushion if needed. At a copy shop, I duplicated important documents, storing the originals in a safe deposit box at the new bank. At a phone store, I purchased a prepaid phone that Dylan wouldn't know about, programming Marianne's number and Elizabeth's as the only contacts. Each practical step steadied me, transforming nebulous anxiety into concrete action. This was no different, I realized, from preparing a care plan for a patient, anticipating needs, addressing potential complications, ensuring all necessary resources were in place before a crisis occurred. After completing the most urgent items, on Marianne's list, I stopped at a small cafe for lunch, allowing myself a moment to breathe before the next phase began. As I sipped coffee, I composed a text to Dylan from my regular phone. "Heading home soon. Attorney meeting went longer than expected. Should be there by 2. His response came almost immediately. "I cleared my afternoon. We'll have time to talk. Love you." The familiar words, "love you," no longer triggered the automatic response they once had. Instead, I found myself analyzing their purpose in Dylan's careful script. Were they genuine remnants of feeling, or merely tools to maintain the performance until his planned exit? It didn't matter, I realized. Whether he had ever truly loved me or simply performed love convincingly was now irrelevant to the path ahead. What mattered was protecting myself, preserving the unexpected gift Mrs. Lillian had given me, and finding a way forward that honored her belief in my worth. Back at Mrs. Lillian's house, my house, I packed an overnight bag with essentials, then stood in the entry hall, taking a final moment of peace before stepping back into performance mode. On impulse, I removed Mrs. Lillian's vintage camera from my purse and placed it carefully on the hall table, alongside a framed photograph of her in her prime. Poised, confident, seeing the world clearly through her chosen lens. "I'll be back," I promised her image. "This is just intermission, not the final curtain." Then I stepped outside, locked the door behind me, and drove toward the home where my husband waited, unaware that the vulnerable, grieving wife he expected to console was arriving with a plan of her own. Our house looked smaller somehow as I pulled into the driveway, as if my expanded perspective had physically shrunk the space that had once contained my entire world. Dylan's car was already there, unusual for early afternoon on a weekday. He was committed to his performance as the supportive husband, clearing his schedule to comfort his grieving wife. I sat in my car for a moment, steadying my breathing, mentally preparing for the role I needed to play. Not just grieving, which required no acting at all. My loss of Mrs. Lillian was genuine and profound, but vulnerable, unsuspecting, unaware of my husband's betrayal. That would require every ounce of self-control I possessed. When I finally entered the house, Dylan was waiting in the kitchen, a sympathetic expression perfectly arranged on his handsome face. He stepped forward immediately, enfolding me in an embrace that once would have felt like coming home. Now I noticed the performance elements, the slightly exaggerated sigh, the careful way his hand cradled my head, the practiced murmur of comfort. "I'm so sorry, babe," he said, his voice gentle. "I know how much she meant to you." I allowed myself to lean into him briefly, to accept the comfort offered even while recognizing its hollow core. Then I stepped back, creating distance without raising suspicion. "The last 24 hours feel surreal," I said, which was entirely true. "I keep expecting her to call." Dylan guided me to the living room sofa, his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that carefully straddled the line between supportive and possessive. "Tell me about the attorney meeting. Nothing complicated, I hope." The question seemed innocent, but I caught the calculating undertone, the subtle fishing for financial information, the assessment of whether my position as Mrs. Lillian's caregiver might translate to any monetary considerations. "Just preliminary discussions about the funeral arrangements," I said vaguely. "Mrs. Lillian left very specific instructions about everything. The service will be next Tuesday." I watched his face carefully, noting the flicker of relief. In his mental timeline, the funeral marked the starting point for his exit strategy. After an appropriate interval following the service, he would begin the careful dismantling of our marriage. "Whatever you need from me, just ask," he offered magnanimously. "I can handle the calls, the arrangements, anything to make this easier for you." I thanked him with appropriate gratitude, knowing he was offering to manage details that didn't interest him to maintain access to information that did. The performance continued through dinner. Takeout he'd ordered from my favorite restaurant, wine poured with solicitous attention, gentle inquiries about my emotional state that never probed too deeply. As evening settled around us, I maintained my role, grieving but not inconsolable, tired but not suspicious, accepting his support without excessive gratitude or skepticism. It was exhausting, this hyper-awareness of every word, every gesture, every flicker of expression. When we finally went to bed, Dylan held me as he had countless nights before, his breathing eventually settling into the rhythm of sleep while I remained acutely, painfully awake. The arm draped across my waist, once a source of comfort, now felt like a restraint. The face peaceful in sleep beside me belonged to a stranger wearing my husband's features. In the darkness, I made a silent promise to myself. This would be temporary. I would endure this performance only as long as necessary to secure my position, to follow Marianne's strategic advice, to ensure that when the final curtain fell on our marriage, I would exit on my own terms rather than according to Dylan's carefully orchestrated script. The days that followed established a new rhythm, a double life where I navigated between Dylan's expectations and my private preparations. Each morning, I played the role of grieving caregiver slowly processing loss. Each afternoon, while Dylan was at his office, I methodically followed Marianne's checklist, securing my future piece by piece. I visited Mrs. Lillian's house, my house, daily, ostensibly to begin organizing her possessions and coordinating with the funeral home. In reality, these visits became anchors of authenticity in an increasingly performative existence. There, surrounded by her photographs and books, I could remove the mask I wore at home with Dylan, could breathe freely, and think clearly about the steps ahead. During one such visit, I found myself drawn to Mrs. Lillian's vast collection of photography books. One volume particularly caught my eye. Transitions. Photography as witness to change. Inside were images documenting pivotal moments of transformation, natural disasters that altered landscapes, revolutions that reshaped nations, intimate portraits of individuals at crucial life junctures. In the margin beside a particularly powerful image of a woman standing in the ruins of her home after a hurricane, Mrs. Lillian had penciled a note. The camera doesn't create the moment of transformation. It merely witnesses it. The transformation was already underway. Something about those words resonated deeply. My transformation hadn't begun when I overheard Dylan in the hospital hallway. It had been underway long before, in small moments, of discontent I'd ignored, in doubts I'd suppressed, in dreams I'd set aside. The revelation had merely made visible what was already in process. I carried that insight with me as I continued my careful preparations. With Marianne's guidance, I documented our assets, secured copies of tax returns and bank statements, created a comprehensive inventory of my personal property, and began quietly moving irreplaceable items, family photographs, jewelry from my mother, personal mementos, to safe storage at Mrs. Lillian's house. On the surface, life continued as normal. Dylan and I shared meals, discussed trivial daily matters, maintained the habits of a married couple. He continued his performance as the supportive husband, attentive to my grief while subtly assessing my emotional recovery timeline, recalibrating his exit strategy accordingly. I matched his performance with one of my own, gradually appearing to emerge from initial shock into functional grief, neither too quick, which might accelerate his plans, nor too slow, which might concern him. I mentioned returning to work soon, caring for other patients, rebuilding my routine, all steps he would interpret as moving toward the vulnerability he anticipated exploiting. But beneath this carefully maintained facade, something new was taking shape. Not just tactical preparations for divorce, but the first tentative imaginings of a life beyond Dylan, beyond the constraints of a relationship built on performance rather than partnership. In quiet moments alone, I allowed myself to consider possibilities that had been unthinkable just days before. Perhaps I would travel with Mrs. Lillian's camera, documenting places she had photographed decades earlier, creating a visual dialogue across time. Perhaps I would establish a foundation to support end-of-life care for those without resources, honoring the work that had brought Mrs. Lillian and me together. Perhaps I would simply take time to rediscover the woman I had been before bending my life around Dylan's ambitions, the woman with dreams and desires of her own. These nascent possibilities felt fragile, tentative, like seedlings requiring protection from harsh elements. I kept them carefully guarded, sharing them with no one, nurturing them in the private sanctuary of my thoughts, while externally maintaining the performance necessary to protect my position. The day before Mrs. Lillian's funeral, as I carefully selected the dress I would wear, I caught myself in a moment of unexpected clarity. I was not just preparing to say goodbye to my beloved patient and friend. I was preparing to say goodbye to the life I had known, to the marriage I had believed, into the future I had anticipated. This understanding brought not just grief, but also a strange, tender sense of possibility. The recognition that endings, painful as they are, create space for new beginnings. That night, as Dylan and I reviewed the funeral program together, his hand covered mine in a gesture of comfort that rang hollow now that I could see the calculation behind it. Yet even as I registered the falseness of the moment, I felt something shifting inside me. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, but a quiet certainty that whatever came next, I would face it with the clear-eyed perspective Mrs. Lillian had cultivated throughout her remarkable life. "I'll be ready for tomorrow," I told Dylan, the words carrying a double meaning he couldn't possibly understand. "More ready than you might expect." Mrs. Lillian's funeral was a small affair, exactly as she had requested. No religious service, No platitudes about eternal peace, just a gathering of those who had known her, sharing memories of her remarkable life and viewing a carefully curated exhibition of her most significant photographs. The attendees were primarily colleagues from her photojournalism days, a few former subjects who had remained in touch, and various caregivers who had assisted her over the years. Dylan stood beside me throughout, his hand at the small of my back, his expression appropriately solemn, the perfect supportive husband. I wondered how many of the sympathetic glances directed our way were based on the assumption that this man truly shared my grief rather than calculated its usefulness to his plans. She would have appreciated this, Dylan murmured as we viewed a striking image of civil rights protesters from the 1960s, simple, dignified, focused on her work. I nodded, unable to voice what I was truly thinking, that Mrs. Lillian would have seen right through him, just as she had in life, that her final gift to me was not just financial security, but the clarity to recognize what she had observed long before I could see it myself. After the service, several guests gathered at Mrs. Lillian's house, my house, for refreshments. Dylan moved through the rooms with practiced charm, accepting condolences on my behalf, subtly establishing himself as my protector during this difficult time. I watched him work the room, noting how each interaction served his narrative, the devoted husband supporting his fragile wife. As the last guests departed, Dylan turned to me with a gentle smile. "You should be proud of how you handled today. Mrs. Montgomery would be." "Lillian," I corrected automatically. She always preferred Lillian. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before the supportive mask slipped back into place. "Of course. Lillian. Sorry, I'm tired too." It was the first genuine reaction I'd seen from him in days. Irritation at being corrected about a detail he considered inconsequential. The small glimpse behind his performance strengthened my resolve. This man, calculating and controlled, was not someone I could continue to build a life with, regardless of what I had overheard in the hospital. "I need to stay here tonight," I said, the words emerging before I'd fully formed the thought. To start sorting through things, Dylan's expression shifted, concern tinged with wariness. This wasn't in his script. "Tonight? Babe, you're exhausted. This can wait a few days." "The estate attorney needs an inventory," I explained, the partial truth coming easily. "And I need to feel close to her right now." He studied me carefully, assessing whether this deviation represented a problem or merely a minor detour in his planned trajectory. "I understand," he said finally. "Do you want me to stay with you?" "No. You have that client meeting tomorrow." "Morning," I reminded him, providing an easy exit. "I'll be fine. I just need some space to process." Relief flickered across his face, quickly masked by reluctant acceptance. "If you're sure. Call me if you need anything. Anytime." After he left, the house settled into peaceful silence. I moved through rooms that now truly felt like mine, touching objects that connected me to Mrs. Lillian, breathing freely for the first time since the funeral preparations began. This unplanned night alone was an unexpected gift, a chance to regroup, to gather strength for the performance that would need to continue until all my preparations were complete. The following week brought the first real test of my resolve. Dylan, perhaps sensing something shifting beneath the surface of our interactions, intensified his performance as the devoted husband. He brought flowers for no reason, suggested weekend getaways to help with the healing process, offered to attend grief counseling sessions with me. Each gesture required careful navigation, accepting enough to maintain the illusion, deflecting excess without raising suspicion. I found myself drawing on skills I'd developed as a caregiver, the ability to set boundaries gently but firmly, to redirect without confrontation, to maintain professional composure even when emotions ran high. "I appreciate everything you're doing," I told him after declining yet another elaborate dinner reservation. "But what I really need right now is normalcy, routine." He nodded understandingly, though I caught the calculation behind his eyes, assessing whether my desire for normalcy accelerated or delayed his timeline, whether my grief was progressing at a pace that served his purposes. The most difficult moments came at night, lying beside him in the darkness, maintaining the physical intimacy expected in marriage while feeling emotionally severed from the man I had once loved. Each touch, each embrace required compartmentalization, separating body from heart, present from future. I found myself retreating to the mental techniques I'd developed caring for difficult patients, focusing on the professional tasks at hand rather than the emotional complexities surrounding them. During daylight hours, I continued my methodical preparations with Marianne's guidance. Each step completed gave me strength for the performance required at home. Each document secured, each asset documented, each legal protection established, created a foundation for whatever came next. 2 weeks after the funeral, the first direct challenge to my resolve arrived in the form of a real estate agent's business card left accidentally visible on Dylan's desk. The agent specialized in luxury condominiums in the downtown district, exactly the type of property Dylan had been secretly researching before I discovered his plans. That evening, he casually mentioned meeting an old college friend for lunch. Julian's looking at downtown condos, asked for my input on the architectural elements, reminded me how much I've always loved urban living. I recognized the strategy, floating the concept of selling our house and moving downtown, gauging my reaction, laying groundwork for the eventual separation of our lives and assets. 2 weeks ago, I might have engaged enthusiastically, might have begun mentally redecorating a space I would never actually inhabit. Instead, I offered mild interest without commitment. Downtown has definitely become more vibrant since we bought this place. How's Julian doing otherwise? The deflection worked, shifting the conversation away from real estate while maintaining the illusion that I had noticed nothing unusual about his sudden interest in urban living options. But that night, as Dylan slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and acknowledged the reality. His timeline was accelerating. The careful groundwork was being laid. The countdown to his planned exit had begun. The next morning, I called Marianne from my secure phone while stopped at a coffee shop between appointments. He's starting to position for the split, I explained, mentioning downtown condos, bringing up friends who are moving. Are your preparations complete? She asked, characteristically direct. Almost. I need another week, maybe 2. Then by that time, she advised. Use his eagerness against him. The more confident he feels about his strategy, the less carefully he'll examine yours. Following her guidance, I began carefully feeding Dylan's confidence. I mentioned offhandedly that our neighborhood was feeling less appealing lately. I asked questions about his friend's downtown condo search. I left brochures about relieving caregiver burnout conspicuously visible, suggesting that I was considering stepping back from my profession after the emotional toll of Mrs. Lillian's death. Each breadcrumb reinforced his assumption that I remained unaware of his plans, that I was moving precisely where he wanted me, that his exit strategy was proceeding smoothly. And each time he took the bait, my resolve strengthened, not just to protect myself legally and financially, but to reclaim the narrative of my own life. 3 weeks after the funeral, as we shared a rare dinner together at home, Dylan casually mentioned a business opportunity that would require significant investment. It could be the turning point for the firm, he explained, eyes bright with what appeared to be genuine excitement. The kind of project I've been waiting for. That sounds promising, I replied carefully. What kind of investment are we talking about? He hesitated, then named a figure that approximated half the equity in our home. The timing was almost laughable. Had I not known his plans, this would have been the moment he began preparing me for the need to refinance or sell our house, creating financial entanglements that would benefit him in the coming divorce. That's substantial, I said, my understatement masking the cold anger blooming beneath my composed exterior. Let me think about it, okay? It's a lot to process with everything else going on. He reached for my hand across the table, his expression a perfect blend of understanding and gentle pressure. Of course, take your time. But this opportunity won't wait forever. Neither would I thought, but didn't say. My preparations were nearly complete. Marianne had all the documentation she needed. My separate finances were secured. The inheritance from Mrs. Lillian was carefully protected from any claim he might make. The performance had served its purpose, buying the time I needed to secure my position. Soon, very soon, the final act would begin. Not with his carefully orchestrated exit, but with my unexpected departure from a script I had never actually agreed to follow. That night, as Dylan discussed potential locations for this fictional business opportunity, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The challenge of maintaining this performance, of navigating his manipulations while protecting my interests, had revealed a strength I hadn't known I possessed. Whatever came next, confrontation, negotiation, separation, rebuilding, I would face it with clear eyes and steady purpose. Mrs. Lillian's voice seemed to whisper in my ear. The most powerful moment in any story is when the subject realizes they are not merely being photographed, they are directing the composition themselves. I was no longer simply a subject in Dylan's carefully framed narrative. I was composing my own image, determining my own perspective, creating my own story. And soon, very soon, I would press the shutter. 1 month after Mrs. Lillian's funeral, I sat in Marianne Slater's office reviewing the final preparations for what she had diplomatically termed the transition. All documents were in order, all assets documented, all legal protections in place. The inheritance from Mrs. Lillian was securely established as separate property. My personal possessions of sentimental value had been quietly relocated to my other house. A new bank account held sufficient funds to sustain me through whatever came next. "You're ready," Marianne said, her tone carrying both approval and concern. "The question now is timing. When and how do you want to proceed?" It was a question I had been contemplating for weeks while maintaining my careful performance at home. The strategic patience that had served me well thus far had also provided unexpected benefits beyond mere legal preparation. It had given me time to process not just the practical implications of Dylan's betrayal, but the emotional consequences as well. The shock and hurt had gradually transformed into something more nuanced, a clear-eyed understanding of both our marriage and myself. I could now see how my caregiving nature had made me vulnerable to someone who presented appreciation for that quality, while privately devaluing it. I could recognize how my willingness to postpone my own dreams had enabled Dylan's expectation, that his ambitions would always take precedence. Most importantly, I had begun to envision a future shaped by my own desires rather than someone else's needs. A future where financial security provided not just protection, but possibility. The $4 million Mrs. Lillian had left me represented more than monetary value. It was a testament to her belief that my care for others was worthy of reciprocation, that my compassion was strength rather than weakness. "I think it's time," I told Marianne, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "I've completed everything on your checklist. There's nothing left to secure or document." "And emotionally?" she asked, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "Are you prepared? For his reaction? For the confrontation? For the aftermath?" I considered her question carefully. A month ago, I might have flinched from the prospect of confrontation, might have sought the path of least resistance even at cost to myself. Now I felt a quiet certainty that whatever came next, anger, manipulation, attempts at reconciliation, I could face it with dignity and resolve. "I'm ready," I said simply. Not eager for conflict, but prepared for it. I've spent enough time living in a performance. I want to return to authenticity, whatever that brings. Marianne nodded, satisfied with my response. "Then let's discuss exactly how this will unfold." The plan we crafted was straightforward and dignified. No dramatic accusations, no emotional ambush, no public scene. I would speak with Dylan privately, inform him that I had overheard his conversation at the hospital, explain that I had secured legal representation, and present the initial separation terms Marianne had prepared. The approach was firm but fair, designed to make clear that while I had no interest in vengeance, I would not be manipulated or disadvantaged. That evening, as I drove home for what would likely be one of my final nights in the house I had shared with Dylan for 6 years, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The double life I had been leading, performing vulnerability while secretly securing strength, had been necessary but exhausting. The prospect of alignment between my outer actions and inner truth, even amid difficult circumstances, felt like relief. Dylan was working late at his office, a common occurrence in recent weeks as he laid groundwork for what he believed would be his imminent exit from our marriage. The house was quiet as I moved through familiar rooms, seeing them now through the lens of transition rather than permanence. This space that had once represented our shared future now felt like a stopping point on a journey to somewhere else. In our bedroom, I packed a small bag with essentials for the next few days. Nothing dramatic enough to signal permanent departure, just enough to sustain me through the initial conversations and separation. The wedding ring I still wore for appearance's sake felt heavy on my finger, a symbol that had lost its meaning but retained its power as a tactical element in this careful unraveling. My phone buzzed with a text from Dylan. "Client dinner running late. Don't wait up. Love you." 3 words that had once meant everything, now revealed as performance rather than truth. I didn't respond, knowing there would be time for words tomorrow. Honest ones, finally, after weeks of careful script following, on both sides. As I prepared for bed in what would likely be one of my last nights in this house, I found myself drawn to Mrs. Lillian's camera, which I had brought home earlier that day. The vintage Leica felt solid in my hands, its mechanisms still smooth despite decades of use. On impulse, I raised it to my eye, focusing on my own reflection in the bedroom mirror. The woman who looked back at me through the viewfinder was both familiar and strange, the same features I had always known, but composed differently now, arranged with a certainty and purpose that had been absent before. I pressed the shutter, capturing this moment of transition, this pause between what had been and what would be. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, revelation, the end of performances on both sides. It would be difficult, perhaps painful, certainly consequential. But as I set the camera aside and prepared for sleep, I felt ready to step into whatever came next, not as the supporting character in someone else's narrative, but as the protagonist of my own unfolding story. Mrs. Lillian's final gift had not been merely financial security, though that was significant. Her true legacy was this moment of clarity, this courage to see and be seen authentically, this permission to value my own worth as she had valued it. Whatever tomorrow brought, I would face it through the lens she had offered, with clear vision, steady hands, and the patience to wait for precisely the right moment to capture truth. As sleep approached, I found myself silently thanking Mrs. Lillian one final time, not just for the inheritance that would secure my future, but for the insight that had illuminated my present. The painful revelation in that hospital waiting room had shattered illusions. Yes, but in doing so had created space for something more valuable. Reality, seen clearly at last. Morning arrived with quiet determination, sunlight filtering through. Curtains I had chosen years ago when this house still represented shared dreams rather than strategic positioning. I rose early, prepared coffee, and waited for Dylan to join me in the kitchen as he did most Saturdays. The familiar routine felt surreal now, knowing it would be the last time we would enact this particular scene. He appeared at 8:30, hair still damp from the shower, wearing the casual weekend clothes that made him look more approachable than his weekday suits. A calculated wardrobe choice I now recognized as part of his carefully constructed image. "You're up early," he commented, accepting the coffee I offered with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Feeling better?" "I need to talk to you," I said simply, not returning his smile. "Something important." His expression shifted subtly. Concern, tinged with assessment, the look of someone gauging whether a situation requires damage control. "Of course. What's going on?" I took a measured breath, meeting his gaze directly. 5 weeks ago, the night Mrs. Lillian died, I overheard you in the hospital. You were speaking with your attorney, Kurt, about divorcing me, about taking half the house because the prenup had expired, about the perfect timing of Mrs. Lillian's death making me more vulnerable. The blood drained from Dylan's face so rapidly I might have been concerned under different circumstances. His coffee cup froze halfway to his lips, his entire body suddenly motionless except for his eyes, which darted rapidly as he processed this catastrophic disruption to his carefully planned narrative. "Heidi, Please don't," I interrupted, my voice steady. "Don't insult both of us by denying what I heard with my own ears. I was in the family consultation room when you and Kurt walked past. I heard everything, Dylan. Every word." He set his cup down carefully, buying seconds to formulate a response. I recognized the technique. I'd seen him use it in tense client meetings when unexpected challenges arose. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted from shock to calculated contrition. "It wasn't what it sounded like," he began, his voice softening. "Kurt was presenting worst-case scenarios, legal options I never intended to pursue. You know how lawyers are. They always prepare for eventualities that reasonable people would never consider. It was a masterful pivot, acknowledging what couldn't be denied while reframing its meaning entirely. A month ago, I might have been swayed by this performance, might have grasped at any explanation that preserved my understanding of our marriage. "I also know how you are," I replied, neither angry nor tearful, simply certain. "I heard the way you spoke, Dylan, not reluctant or hypothetical, strategic, calculated. You've been planning this for months." He abandoned the denial strategy immediately, shifting tactics with the agility that had once impressed me in professional settings. "Our marriage has been struggling," he conceded, spreading his hands in a gesture of openness. "We both know that. But consulting an attorney doesn't mean I wanted to end things. It means I was exploring options, trying to understand where we stood legally, while waiting for the perfect moment when I would be emotionally devastated and financially vulnerable," I added, completing his thought. Dylan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Another practiced gesture I now recognized as performance rather than genuine distress. "You're making it sound cold-blooded. I was trying to find the least painful way forward for both of us. By planning to take half the house when I would have nowhere else to go? By timing it to exploit my grief?" I kept my voice level, determined to maintain dignity rather than giving him emotional reactions to manipulate. "That doesn't sound like minimizing pain, Dylan. It sounds like maximizing advantage." He leaned forward, eyes intent on mine, shifting to what I now recognized as his persuasive mode. The approach he used with reluctant clients or skeptical investors. "Heidi, we can work through this. Couples hit rough patches. They consider options they'd never actually pursue. What matters is that we're talking now, being honest with each other." The irony of his emphasis on honesty might have made me laugh under different circumstances. Instead, I simply reached into my pocket and withdrew a folded document. "I've retained an attorney," I said, placing the paper on the table between us. "Marianne Slater. She's prepared an initial separation agreement that I believe is fair to both of us. I'd like you to review it, ideally with Kurt, and let me know if you have concerns." Dylan stared at the document as if it might suddenly ignite. This was not in his script. Not just my awareness of his plans, but my proactive response to them. I had rewritten the narrative he had so carefully constructed, had transformed myself from vulnerable victim to composed adversary. An attorney? He repeated, his composure finally cracking. For how long? How long have you been planning this behind my back? The accusation might have wounded me once. Now I recognized it for what it was: projection, deflection, an attempt to reposition himself as the wronged party rather than the architect of deception. Since the night I overheard you, I answered honestly. I've spent the past month securing my position, just as you've spent the past several months securing yours. The difference is that I was doing it in response to betrayal, not as its author. His expression hardened, the mask of contrition falling away to reveal cold calculation beneath. What position? The house is mortgaged to its limit. Your little caregiving job barely covers groceries. What exactly do you think you're securing? And there it was. The contempt beneath the performance, the true assessment he had always held of my work, my contribution, my worth. I felt a strange gratitude for this moment of authenticity, ugly as it was. It confirmed everything I had come to understand during our years together. Mrs. Lillian left me everything, I said quietly. Her house, her investments, her photography collection, approximately $4 million in total. The shock that registered on Dylan's face was genuine this time, complete, unfiltered disbelief followed by the dawning realization of what this meant for his carefully constructed exit strategy. $4 million, he repeated, his voice barely audible. That's not... She can't have... She did, I confirmed. The same day you were discussing how perfectly timed her death was for your divorce plans, I was meeting with her attorney to learn that she had named me her sole heir. The irony is almost poetic, don't you think? Dylan's face cycled through emotions rapidly. Shock, disbelief, calculation, and finally something resembling respect tinged with wariness. He was reassessing me, recalibrating his understanding of our positions, recognizing that the power dynamic he had assumed was now fundamentally altered. So what happens now? He asked, his voice carefully neutral, a negotiator recognizing the need for a new approach. I gestured to the document on the table. Review the agreement. It's fair. Equitable division of our actual marital assets. Reasonable timeline for selling the house and distributing proceeds. No claim on your business. No demand for ongoing support. No punitive measures despite the circumstances. And your inheritance? He asked, unable to entirely mask the calculation in his voice. Is separate property, not subject to division? I replied firmly. Just as your business would have been your separate property in the divorce you were planning. Dylan was silent for a long moment, studying me with new eyes. Not as the supportive wife, not as the vulnerable caregiver, but as an equal adversary in a negotiation he had not anticipated. I underestimated you, he said finally, a statement of fact rather than apology. Yes, I agreed simply. You did. As he reached for the separation agreement, his wedding ring caught the morning light, the custom band he had once described as symbolic of our perfect fit. I was already no longer wearing mine. I'll be staying at Mrs. Lillian's house, my house, while we work through this, I told him, rising from the table. Marianne's contact information is in the document. Have Kurt reach out to her directly, with any questions. Dylan looked up from the papers, his expression unreadable. When did you become this person, Heidi? This... calculated. The question might have wounded me once, might have made me doubt my approach or soften my position out of habitual accommodation. Now I recognized it for what it was, a final attempt to make me question my worth, to define my strength as a character flaw. I've always been this person, I replied calmly. You just never bothered to truly see me. As I walked out of the kitchen, out of the house, out of the marriage that had defined the past 6 years of my life, I felt neither triumph nor grief, but something more complex. The bittersweet certainty of necessary endings making space for new beginnings. In my car, Mrs. Lillian's vintage camera sat on the passenger seat, a tangible reminder of the woman who had seen my worth clearly enough to safeguard my future, who had recognized what I couldn't until that moment in the hospital waiting room, that sometimes the most important image is the one that reveals truth rather than maintaining illusion, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. I started the engine and drove toward my other house, toward the future I was now free to imagine on my own terms, leaving behind the carefully constructed performance that had never been an actual life. Just a series of posed moments creating the illusion of connection where none truly existed. The road ahead was uncertain in its details but clear in its direction. Forward, into a life defined by authenticity rather than accommodation. By self-worth rather than external validation. By choices made from strength rather than vulnerability. It was time to begin. 6 months after that final conversation with Dylan, I stood in the gallery space that had once been Mrs. Lillian's formal dining room, now transformed into the first exhibition area of what would soon become the Lillian Montgomery Foundation for Visual Truth. Around me, her most significant photographs hung in careful arrangements, images that had captured moments of transformation, courage, and revelation across decades of social change. The divorce had been finalized with surprising efficiency once Dylan realized the power dynamic he had anticipated exploiting had been fundamentally reversed. Our house sold quickly, the proceeds divided according to the agreement Marianne had crafted. I had offered no resistance to his claims regarding business assets, furniture, or joint accounts. The inheritance from Mrs. Lillian had granted me something far more valuable than any object we had shared: the freedom to be generous without being vulnerable, to concede points without compromising my worth. In the months since our separation, I had gradually redesigned my life according to values long subordinated to Dylan's ambitions. I continued my work as a caregiver, but on my own terms, establishing a small agency specializing in end-of-life care, providing services regardless of clients' ability to pay, creating the employment conditions I had always wished for myself and my colleagues. The foundation funded what client payments could not, ensuring that dignity in final days was not a luxury reserved for those with resources. Mrs. Lillian's, my Victorian home, now served dual purposes: my private residence upstairs and the key Foundation's offices and gallery space on the main floor. The transformation had been gradual, respectful of the home's history while creating something new and meaningful from its spaces. Much like my own evolution, I reflected, honoring the past while refusing to be constrained by it. As I adjusted the lighting on a particularly powerful image of a civil rights protester facing police lines with quiet dignity, Elizabeth appeared in the doorway. "It's perfect," she said, taking in the exhibition layout. She would have approved. I nodded, grateful for her friendship, which had deepened in the absence of Dylan's subtle discouragement. "I hope so. The foundation launches officially next week." "And the photography workshops for hospice patients?" Elizabeth asked, referring to the program I'd developed to give those approaching the end of life an opportunity to document their own experiences through their chosen lens. "First session starts Thursday," I confirmed. Mrs. Lillian always said the camera offers a way to reclaim agency even when circumstances seem beyond control. I want others to have that opportunity. As we moved through the gallery spaces, I found myself reflecting on the journey of the past months, not just the practical rebuilding of my life, but the deeper transformation of my understanding of myself, of relationships, of the difference between performance and authenticity. The waiting room revelation had been painful, shattering my perception of my marriage and forcing me to confront difficult truths. Yet from that shattering had emerged something stronger, clearer, more genuine than what had existed before. Like a photograph developing in solution, the true image had gradually emerged from the exposure to harsh reality. Not always beautiful, but undeniably authentic. Dylan had contacted me only once since the divorce was finalized, a brief email acknowledging what he termed my impressive strategic maneuvering. There was no apology for his planned betrayal, no recognition of the pain his deception had caused, just a professional assessment from one tactical mind to another. I hadn't responded. Some silences speak more truthfully than any words could. "You know what still amazes me?" Elizabeth said as we completed our tour of the exhibition space. "How you managed to transform something that should have destroyed you into something that ultimately empowered you. Most people wouldn't have found that strength." I considered her observation, thinking of Mrs. Lillian's photographs surrounding us, images that had captured painful realities while simultaneously illuminating the dignity and resilience of their subjects. "I think that strength was always there," I said finally. "I just couldn't see it while I was busy looking through someone else's lens." That evening, I sat alone on the porch of my home, watching the sun set over gardens I was gradually reshaping in my own vision. Mrs. Lillian's vintage Leica rested beside me, now a regular companion as I developed my own eye for capturing truth through its viewfinder. The path from that hospital waiting room to this peaceful porch had been neither straight nor easy. There had been moments of doubt, of grief, of anger so intense it threatened to consume me. Yet each step, however painful, had moved me toward greater authenticity, toward a life built on clear vision rather than comfortable illusions. The inheritance Mrs. Lillian had left me was significant. The financial security that had prevented me from becoming the vulnerable victim Dylan had anticipated, the foundation that would carry her legacy forward into new generations. But her true gift had been the example of a life lived with open eyes, the courage to see and be seen clearly, the understanding that truth, however uncomfortable, is preferable to the most beautiful fiction. As darkness settled around me, I lifted Mrs. Lillian's camera and captured one final image of the day, the transitional moment between light and shadow, between ending and beginning, between what was and what might yet be. In that liminal space, I found not certainty, but possibility, not closure, but opening, not an ending, but a continuing. The camera clicked, preserving the moment. Whatever came next, whatever joys or challenges, connections or solitudes, I would face it with clear eyes, seeing both others and myself as we truly were rather than as I might wish us to be. That clarity, I had learned, was not always comfortable, but was always valuable, always worth the momentary pain of revelation. Sometimes the most important discoveries happen in the most unlikely places, a hospital waiting room, a conversation, never meant for our ears, a moment of accidental truth that changes everything that follows. In those moments, we have a choice, to look away and preserve comfortable illusions, or to keep looking, to see clearly, to allow that clarity to transform us completely. I had chosen to see. And though the path that choice had set me on was not the one I had once imagined for myself, it was authentically mine. Every step taken with open eyes, every direction chosen with clear vision, every moment lived in truth rather than performance. As I gathered my camera and turned toward the warm light of home, my home, not shared or borrowed or contingent but truly mine, I felt gratitude wash over me, not just for Mrs. Lillian's financial legacy, but for her final and most precious gift. The permission to value my own worth as she had valued it, to see myself through my own lens rather than someone else's, to create a life defined by authenticity rather than accommodation. The waiting. Room revelation had shattered one story, but from those fragments, I had composed something new, a narrative of my own creation, a future of my own design, a life viewed through my own carefully chosen lens. And in that composition, at last, I found myself exactly where I belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.